cranking up on the throttle, victory is mine. Show you the harder the battle, harder I fight. I've come too far to quit. Step back, I'm going in. I'm cranking up on the throttle. This is how legends are made. This is how legends are made. This is how legends are made.
Hello and welcome, everyone. We are here tonight going to be going through the history of the Italian battleships with the revival of the Ships of the Line stream, which has kind of been on hiatus for the past 6 months or so. We're bringing it back. Plan to do it probably once every about 2 months here and there. And we will also have a straw poll to determine what the next one will be towards later in the stream. But I am not alone tonight. I am joined for the first time ever on Ships of the Line by the wonderful Orochi.
Due to popular demand, well, actually, it wasn't really popular. I'm here for you, for your pleasure, enjoyment, and meme generation, I guess, at this point, to give a shot at all the Italian battleships we have in the game, or at least the historically significant ones. So, welcome everyone to Ships of the Line. I'm extremely honored to be on one for the first time, and since I'm the closest thing to an Italian the team has, it kind of made sense, guys. Like, come on. Hello everyone. Buff Giuseppe Verdi. We'll see Giuseppe Verdi today.
Yeah, so we're going to be covering everything from the pre-World War I ships, from Dante Alighieri all the way through to basically Marco Polo era, because Lepanto and Cristoforo Colombo are not truly historical ships. So the last historically-ish ship is Marco Polo and Giuseppe Verdi, which are twins. The truly last historical ship is Vittorio Veneto and Roma in the game. But we have plenty of stories to go through, some personalities to look at as well, that are very pivotal in both of the design of Italian battleships and also battleships worldwide. Because the origin of the idea of the old big gun battleship, at least formally recognized and publicized, is Italy, with the ship designer Vittorio Cuniberti.
So, as you can probably understand, guys, most of the stream is going to be me just playing the ships and just looking at blip like this. Because, let's be honest, my historical knowledge is not the best, although this guy is making it look so cool that I'm actually starting to get into it, okay? Like, please, Blip, can you show them the fanciest notebook I've ever seen in my life?
The notebook of wisdom is back. It is full. We're actually almost to the end of it. So I'm going to have to actually get more paper for this soon. But we have the returning notebook of wisdom that's full of just all of the different Ships of the Line streams. Maybe we should just auction off the pages at some point. I don't know, or as a meme. But we've got plenty of notes and plenty of things to cover, including things like the myth, legend, reality, mixture of all the three of the Italian battleship guns inaccuracy, and they because there's many different answers or possible answers as to why they seem to have poor accuracy, but also sometimes they seem to have really good accuracy. So who knows? Nobody actually really knows, but we have plenty of ideas about why it is. And yes, it is real leather. This is basically a bougie French leather notebook. I can't even remember what La Compagnie du Craft book, but it is very, very nice.
I don't even want to know how much this costs, but it looks so nice.
It stonks.
Like, it makes me want to get back to studying, taking notes again.
Indeed. But I apologize in advance. There is no way that I'm getting through this stream without butchering some Italian name. So any Italian viewers out there, Please forgive me. I am an American who does not understand the things like romantic languages. I can do German. I cannot do Italian. I can't do Spanish. So we'll see how it goes.
I will try my best to kind of try and suggest how I think this should be pronounced. But as I said earlier, like I'm the closest thing to an Italian the team has, but I'm not nearly close enough to actually pronounce the names correctly. Okay.
Yeah.
So we're gonna try our best. We're definitely gonna see how these battleships from history get into the game, how they are, and hopefully I will be able to provide some decent-ish battles for you guys today.
Yep. So without further ado, let's try and get into it. The Italian battleships are essentially very interesting ships. All of them have very unique engineering solutions to problems that they either perceived or ran into, and also have very unique takes on what they think battleship battles are going to be like. And almost all of them are not nearly as well protected as they should be. Basically, Italian battleships almost consistently bring up the very bottom tier of basically the percentage of weight and armor that any battleships have, especially with the early dreadnought battleships. So that's going to be an ongoing theme of basically is like we're finding an engineering solution to this, but maybe it's not quite enough for reality. And so they have a lot of very ingenious solutions and things like this. They have, and another thing is Italian crew members. We will not accept any slander of Italian crew through this entire stream. They, the Italian, like while maybe the use of such ships has been derided and basically say, oh, they could have done more. The reality is far different whenever you're there in person and making decisions on the fly. So we're not going to be judging any of that. But I will say that Italian crewmen, as a whole, and sailors were excellent crewmen, fought their hardest, and did so with honor. And so you can see these throughout many of the different actions, less so with the battleships because they didn't get to do very much action, but especially through various different cruiser actions and destroyer actions, the Italian Navy acquitted themselves very well. But that doesn't help them escape from other problems that maybe their ships or their doctrine ran into. So, so by the way,
I'm like overwhelmed with information right now.
So if you ever have any questions, do not feel free to stop me because I speak very quickly and go through.
No, that's completely fine. I will either have questions which like as I play, I will definitely have, but I will also be reading chat. So if you guys have a question about what Prince Blip is saying, or like you want any extra information, it's very likely that the guy knows already, so we won't even take the time to actually search it up. So definitely ask away. Again, the focus is gonna be on Italian battleships only for this stream at least. And these are the battleships you're gonna be seeing me play today, and these are gonna be the battleships we're gonna talk about in terms of history and facts and all the little bits of information that Prince Blip keeps in his hard drive.
And so, and like all hard drives, sometimes they skip over things and forget a little bit. So
That's completely
so there are a bunch of myths about the Italian Navy, and of course, the Italian Navy is relatively poorly studied in English at this point in time. So that is getting better, especially with new people like Italian Military Archives on YouTube, providing both or being very familiar with the Italian military archives themselves, as well as providing sources and stories in English and Italian. For a long time, there's basically only been one English-Italian author that's been doing the history of these ships, Emilio Bagnasco, who essentially wrote the books on the Italian Navy ships. Huge shout out to him because I used his books for this video. Also, shout out to Italian Military Archives for helping out a little bit, and also some other sources that I pieced together. one thing is essentially the Italian crewmen were very difficult fighters, and or basically Cunningham, Admiral Cunningham, you recognize him from the English line. When most of his time in World War II was spent fighting the Italians, and he had this to say about the Italian sailors, which is, quote, "It was always a surprise to me how the Italian seamen continued to operate their ships in the face of the dangers that beset them." Essentially, it was always impressive to him how well they would fight, outnumbered, undergunned, and fight on to the very end in many ways. So the Italian crewmen were the highest exemplars of sailors that you could see during the war. But getting into what we are talking about, the battleships, no discussion of Italian battleships or really any early dreadnoughts would be complete without discussing the personality that is the engineer Vittorio Cuniberti. He actually has a ship named after him in game, one of the destroyers, I think Tier 7 or 8 destroyer? No, it's Tier 7 destroyer. Essentially, Cuniberti is the father of the idea of the all-big gun battleship, or what we call today is the dreadnought. He wrote a series of publications in both Jane's fighting ships, which, if you're not familiar with Jane's, it's essentially the largest publication of all the world, or that is literally called All the World's Fighting Ships. And they've been publishing basically encyclopedias of warships, of what they believe warships are, based off of what their intelligence gatherings is. They've been publishing this for 100 plus years. And and he makes a publication of what he believes would be the ideal battleship for the Royal Navy, that is the UK Royal Navy, and it's also publicized in German and Italian publications.
So he suggested what? Was this before the war or?
Yeah, this is in like 1902.
So he suggested what battleships the UK Navy should have.
Yeah, essentially, he basically says that a navy that has virtually infinite funding should develop ships that are superior to everything else. And the way to do the next step from pre-dreadnought battleships is to make it all big guns, which is essentially making a battleship that has a broadside of like 8 12-inch guns or 11-inch guns, whatever size you choose, in order to make a battleship that is able to basically smash down any pre-dreadnought battleship by itself. And so he comes out with this publication. It's not clear whether or not this specific publication influenced the UK into making Dreadnought. It probably helped. We don't know if it is actually connected with Jackie Fisher's creation of HMS Dreadnought. However, it is very likely that at least this publication was read by several Royal Navy officers, which helped convince them that maybe the Admiral Fisher has a good idea here and we should build Dreadnought. And so this publication predates all of that, and essentially sets the ball rolling for both the UK, the US, Germany, and Italy in building these ships. But we do see a little bit of a delay in Italy getting onto the ball with this, and a huge delay with France, frankly. And another thing to keep in mind with any Italian ship is that they're looking at the context of France as an enemy, UK as a potential enemy, and the Austria-Hungary as an enemy, at least during World War I. They don't really care that much about the US. They don't really care at all about Japan, and not really caring about what Germany's doing, because all of those nations don't have interests in the Mediterranean, and they, generally speaking, aren't going to be a belligerent against them. So what they're worried about is, how do we defend Italy? How do we defend our holdings in Mediterranean, and maybe a little bit into the Red Sea and Indian Ocean, because they have holdings in like Eritrea and Ethiopia at some various points in time. So they're not really looking at long-range battleships that need to be able to cross the Pacific. They're looking at their puddle that is the Mediterranean Ocean.
So it's my understanding that he was, I wouldn't say a scientist necessarily, but basically a theoretical scientist of how battleships as a concept should progress.
Yeah.
Which is not really focused on armor, but focused on piercing armor.
Yeah, essentially he wants us to like have a ship that like is somewhat protected, although his kind of his last like famous ships were very poorly protected, but very fast. So he was kind of like also into the direction of even into battle cruisers a little bit, but that was his main concept was getting a ship that has overwhelming firepower against the enemy. And so that was his core concept, because there is a concept known as I think it's the Lanchester rule, where essentially the more guns you have in a fight, the more likely you are going to win that fight in terms of a naval engagement, where essentially if you have 12 guns and the enemy has 8 guns, you are more likely to win the fight because you will take out more of his guns over time. And so it's essentially it's a snowball effect where, because you can knock out different guns. And so if you knock out one gun on an 8 gun ship, then they're down to 7 and you still have 12. And then they can't do damage. They're less likely to do damage to you over time.
It becomes a bit of a war of attrition, I guess, in terms of available gun.
Yeah, it is a mathematical game and war of attrition, which we'll see in the early Italian battleships to have 12 and 13 guns apiece.
So basically the strategy was have more gun than opponent.
Use gun.
Use gun and
if that don't work,
be speedier as well.
Use more gun.
Yes, and have the speed to not get hit as much, I assume, right?
Yeah, and because at this point in time, in the looking at early 1900s, the ability for fire control systems, if they exist, which we'll get into that, to track targets that are going faster than like 20 knots or 24, 25 knots is essentially not there. That ability is developed during World War One, and so there is a saying that speed is armor that comes from this time, where essentially you couldn't really effectively aim at somebody that was going fast at that point.
This kind of transfers to the game as well, to an extent.
To an extent, yeah. And so after his publications, the U.S. and the U.K. start developing their own all big gun battleships. Technically speaking, the South Carolina project starts before Dreadnought, but it takes forever to get completed. And so Dreadnought becomes the first all big gun battleship and gives the name to all subsequent battleships, essentially. The Italy cannot justify the expense of building these new dreadnoughts at this point in time, so they stay a little bit behind the ball until Austria-Hungary comes knocking and basically says, we're going to do a big battleship. And so there are some research into battleships beforehand. They have a little bit of different configurations with different guns on the side of the ship, single gun turrets, twin gun turrets, triple gun turrets. They don't really look into quadruples at this point in time. And then essentially the rumor comes out that Austria-Hungary is making a battleship with 12 guns and 4 triple turrets, and so Italy needs a response. Their minimum at that point in time is to have 12 guns and 3 triple turrets, or at least 12 guns of 12-inch caliber, 305 millimeter.
Here's a question on the topic of turrets. Was there ever a quintuple turret?
Technically, no. Trying to think if there was any turrets with hats, but I can't think of any. So there was this concept that basically only the U.S. Navy really chased down. They tried it a couple of times where they would do a turret with a turret on top of it. Essentially, you would have a twin 305 millimeter gun turret with a twin 8-inch gun turret on top of it. This was in their pre-Dreadnought time period. And
the weird time of designing battleships. One of the weird times.
And so it was not a good idea because essentially, in order to get ammunition to the top turret, you have to get it all the way through the bottom turret, which means that it slows down the operation in the bottom turret and slows down the operation in the top turret. And so everybody's having a bad time because there's just not enough room. So turrets with hats is not a good idea. But in terms of quintuple gun turrets, I've seen a few in designs, but I can't think of any that were ever built. And if they were, it would be a weird pre-dreadnought era type thingamajig. And so Italy has the distinction of being the first nation to design a triple turret and lay down a battleship with a triple turret. However, Austria-Hungary beats them to the punch because they build theirs faster. So Austria-Hungary gets their Tegethoff-class battleships in the water and commissioned before Italy does. This is generally an issue with with both Italy and France during this time period. They did not have naval funding to really speed along battleship production. And also having the facilities in order to do so is very taxing and expensive. So they lay down their first battleship, Dante Alighieri, in 1907, and then it takes them until 1911 to get it in service, which is quite a long time for battleship development. For context, in 1912, the super dreadnoughts from the UK are coming online. So the Orion class comes in 1912. So they get their first generation dreadnought a year before super dreadnoughts become a thing.
And wait, let me cut you here. As we're talking about Dante Alighieri, maybe I should try to get in a battle real quick.
Yep, go for it.
So we take a pause from history to just check Dante Alighieri a bit in the game. We have two versions of Dante Alighieri. We have the one from Tech Tree, and we have Dante Alighieri Black, which, if I remember correctly, has a slightly bigger range on secondaries as well. The way I usually build Dante Alighieri is for secondaries, but that's more of a meme build, to be honest with you. So I'm going to switch. I'm going to go to Iacino.
Betrayal.
Don't worry, guys. We are going to try a lot of secondary stuff with the Italian battleships later on. But for the first one, using Sunhorse, Cunningham as inspirations, and this exact commander build. Obviously, for camos, I have to go with Regia Marina.
Yep.
There is no other way. And obviously, Giuseppe Verdi flag. Okay? This is very important. This is a very important part of the build, guys. So let's queue up, try and get a battle, and I'll let Prince Philip continue.
Yep. And so so essentially, very commonly throughout this whole experience, Italy goes for high tech in their designs, except they go a little bit of a different direction. They tend to try to go high tech in their guns and in their fire control systems, though not at this point in time, and in their protection systems. The thing that they go high tech with Dante Alighieri out of the bat is triple turrets and turbines. And also a little bit of oil firing. They kind of come out of the back with some oil-fired boilers in their ships, which is something that the UK only starts dabbling with a few generations of dreadnoughts in, and essentially almost nobody actually really goes for like true oil-firing battleships until the middle of the 1910s. And so Italy kind of gets a little bit ahead of the game with their oil-fired boilers.
So the question, what is an oil-firing boiler?
So essentially you have...
I don't want like extremely mechanic specifics because I quit mechanics in like...
It's very, very simply. At this point in time, you have either coal-fired boilers, mixed-fire boilers, which is coal and oil, or oil-firing boilers. And so oil-fire boilers provide the advantage of you don't need people literally shoveling coal in it to get power, which is a huge advantage. You have coal in terms of your fuel, which is another really, really big advantage because that allows you to refuel and much quicker. Everything is cleaner. So our restream is frozen, but I think we're still going. We'll see here.
It should be fine.
I think the restream is just acting up, but the coal does add some armor protection, but it's not really. It's a bonus. It's not good armor in any way. The main thing is that coal is just annoying to deal with in every way, and it's also can be dangerous because coal powder. So whenever you've used up a lot of your coal, or maybe if you covered your ship in coal dust, coal powder is explosive, and so nobody wants that anywhere. And also it's firstly it's flammable, and if it's in a contained space, it's explosive. So the idea was get away from that as much as I can and use oil as soon as I can. So that's kind of one of the high-tech things to kind of get off the bat and get going. The sorry, trying to keep up here. So with Dante Alighieri, we have triple turrets, turbines. And it's designed by Edoardo Masdia, based off of Cuniberti's proposals. The Cuniberti had kind of moved on from ship design at this point in time, and also he was getting up there in age. So
How old was Cuniberti? Around that time?
he was probably in his 50s or 60s at this point. So so essentially he gave the idea, and then other people took it and ran with it. The Dante Alighieri has strong similarity to Russian design doctrine. It's like visually speaking, it's pretty similar to Gangut. For context with the Gangut designs, they did a competition series, and some of the designs were very similar. So but they got designs ranging across the board. There's no direct connection between the two ships, but it's very clearly the same sort of thinking going behind them.
Much gun, basically.
Yeah. The name Dante Alighieri is from the poet Dante's. You might have heard of Dante's Inferno. That's Dante Alighieri, the poet. It's the only battleship ever named for a poet in history.
Wait, no, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Unless, well, Leonardo da Vinci probably wrote some poems, but he's not known for it.
Yeah, I wouldn't say Leonardo da Vinci is commonly remembered as a poet.
Yeah, and so as I was mentioning, this ship is coal and oil firing. So essentially, 7 of the boilers, or they had. Let me do math. Math on stream is never a good idea. They had 23 boilers in Dante Alighieri. 7 of them were oil firing, and then 16 of them were oil and coal firing, mixed firing. And this allowed them to essentially, you could cruise on one or the other, save some money, save some expense, and also be able to operate at much higher speeds for longer. But it had a very short range of 3,000 cruising miles, which is exceptionally short for a battleship. However, you got to keep in mind, they're just operating in the Mediterranean. They don't have to go across the Pacific. They don't have to go very far in general. Dante Alighieri goes out into the Atlantic like once in her entire service, has a bad time because their seakeeping is not very good.
Yeah, to the Atlantic, like which part? Was it just outside the Mediterranean, or was
Basically, they went out to the west coast of Spain.
Okay.
And that part of it, which is not a very nice part of the Atlantic.
Weather and condition-wise, or
like the coast is the west coast of Spain is pretty nice, but in terms of getting out there in the ocean, there's some funky stuff out there. And there's actually a picture of Dante Alighieri while she's out there, and it's like during the middle of a storm, and she's just like listing like 20 degrees, like going over a wave. It's not really good.
doesn't sound very fun indeed.
So they had some work to do in terms of the ship stability and keeping things level or on an even keel. She had only a 10-inch belt armor, which is 250 millimeters. With a deck armor of only 1.5 inches, which is 38 millimeters. So in terms of protection, she is easily the worst of the first generation dreadnoughts, except maybe Corbeil is worse, the French one. And her armor only makes up 20% of her displacement Normally, for a battleship, you are going to want to have your armor take up maybe like probably about 27 to 35% of your displacement, depending on how heavily armored you want to be. And she's only at 20%. So very, very much under armored, as many of these ships are. But part of the idea was to, first off, distribute the armor in semi-thin layers across the whole ship to protect it against high explosive. So almost the entire ship is covered with some kind of armor to keep it protected. This was an early thought process at the time, especially after the Battle of Tsushima, where a lot of high explosive was fired and did the majority of the damage. So a lot of people were afraid of extensive high explosive damage. So you see, especially with the Italian ships and with the Russian ships, very minimal superstructures, not very big bridges, and armor everywhere. And so she had also 20 120 millimeter secondary guns, and also is the first dreadnought battleship to have turreted secondaries. She has four small turrets on each of the four corners of the ship, but they did not like how well the turrets performed in service, and so they did not continue that design later on. And they had some problems with getting water in them, and essentially not reaching the rates of fire and crew comfort standards that they wanted to meet. And Dante Alighieri was commanded by Paolo di Revel during World War I. So the commander that we have in the game for brawling was also the commander of Dante Alighieri for a little while, a couple of years, if I remember correctly. But after World War I, she was well and truly out of date, and there was basically she did some fire control testing to kind of try to bring Italy up to speed on fire control, and she had her foremast replaced with a tripod mast for a little short time in the 1920s, but she was scrapped in 1928.
So, Blip, first of all, we just finished the battle.
Yeah.
I think I did well, but didn't go our way. I see some questions in the chat. Orochi sounds like Greek. Am I right? Yes, he is Greek. Apart from that, you did not stop me when I tried to change to Yatsino, because I didn't know River was actually the captain of that battleship. Otherwise, I'd keep him for the historical significance of it.
Yep. And so essentially, whenever they were putting together the design for this ship, basically by pure luck, they had designed a triple turret for the 305 millimeter gun in 1905. And so basically they're getting ready to design these ships in 1905, 1906. And then they're basically like, wait, we did an engineering experiment to see if we could do a triple turret. Why don't we just take that? And so the origin of the Italian triple turret on Dante Alighieri is essentially luck. They just happened to have triple turret designs in the process, and then figured we can do it, and went for it.
So they figured it was like because they remembered they had it.
Mm-hmm.
I see. Well,
and at the time, we're looking at a ship that has 1.5 times the average broadside firepower of other contemporary battleships. So if you look at Dreadnought, she has an 8-gun broadside, and Dante Alighieri has a 12-gun broadside. And on paper, at least by the design year 1907, she is on ball. But by the time that she gets into service, which is 1911 to 1913, depending on which time you really consider her to be truly ready for service, she is no longer really on the ball, because people are moving on to even bigger guns. Other ships have as many guns, like the Wyoming class in the U.S. Navy. So they start the ball rolling and then kind of let it die in production a little bit. The another interesting thing with these ships is they have triple bottom hulls, which essentially means that the bottom of the hull you have 3 layers between the ocean and the like first deck of the ship, essentially.
3 floors.
Yeah, and so it means that there's basically subdivision, so you can you can get a hole in the bottom of the ship, and it won't flood the whole ship. It'll just flood the first layer.
Probably also just
Yeah.
sink the ship a little
Oh
bit,
yeah, it would. But essentially, it's extra protection layers, especially against underwater bomb explosions, underwater mine explosions, things like this. And so, which they were becoming the thing at this point in time, but we're not looking at anything that has any kind of torpedo protection yet. They also didn't have any real fire control system in these ships yet, so it's still kind of like get a rangefinder, figure out the range, and then tell the turrets what to shoot at. It's still kind of basic hand math type fire control. They did eventually incorporate some fire control in the dreadnoughts during World War One. Essentially, Britain was like, no. You need to get a little bit further up to date, and Britain gives them some fire control tables.
So how did these first look like? Because, okay, obviously they weren't completely eyeballing it for most of the time, although I think this also happened, especially to close range combat. There were calculations that were done with like pen and paper, but what was the first actual like mechanism that made like fire controlling a thing?
So during the kind of the origin of fire control is in the U.S. Navy, and in terms of at least practical usage of it, you have essentially during the Battle of Luzon Bay, Manila Bay, which is where the USS Olympia and George Dewey was attacking the Spanish Navy during the Spanish-American War. Essentially, the fire control was there was a guy standing on the turret with a homemade rangefinder, figuring out what the range was, and
then we should fire around there.
It's like fire at 6,000 meters and this heading, because that was kind of the beginning of fire control, and they found that it was more accurate than normal, but nowhere near accurate than that should have been, because they only achieved like 2% hits during the battle. It was like abysmally low accuracy for the range, and they wanted to make improvements on that. And so rangefinders became a formalized thing on ships throughout the end of the 1890s and the beginning of the 1900s, and then the
2% main battery accuracy, around my accuracy basically. So like I'm historically accurate in this game.
And then the UK pick it up and build basically what's called the dryer table, or the range finding table, where they can input different factors and kind of calculate it in one place and then send it to everybody, send it to all the turrets. And so the UK kind of takes the rangefinder complex and a few other information gathering devices and then combines them into one place and then sends them to the turrets. And so with a plotting room and things like this. So, and it gets more and more advanced and more capable over time throughout the early 1900s. And so it's a kind of a mixture of both. And one of the key figures in developing rangefinder in the U.S. Navy is William Sims, which is why he's the accuracy commander, not William Lee or Willis Lee.
I didn't actually know that.
Sims is a big proponent of fire control during in the U.S. Navy. So so the Italians also do something. Pull up Dante real quick.
Yes.
This ship also works, but Dante, they have this concept in the early 1900s, and look at it from the side, would you? And zoom out. They want to have their ships as symmetrical as they can be from the front to the back. And so that's why they have the double stacks the way they are, with the mast in between them, in between the turrets, so that at a distance, if you're looking at the ship, it is not so easy to tell what direction it's going in. And so a lot of their ships at this point in time have this sort of symmetrical design to it. And if you go even to Conte di Cavour, you'll see it there as well. And essentially, they build them to where, like, could it be going forwards? Could it be going backwards? I'm not entirely sure. And that was just kind of their concept.
I'm just now realizing this, guys, as well. It makes sense.
Yeah. And so whenever you're thinking about it, if you're looking at them through a pair of binoculars at, from 4 or 5 kilometers away, it can be difficult unless they're moving at speed and the smoke is trailing. You're not going to know exactly what direction it's going in.
And those battleships were not really known for their speed, weren't they? So it would be actually quite like if I didn't have the flags equipped, I can't remove all of them, obviously. Like I wouldn't. It would be kind of hard to tell.
Yeah, and even flags go in the flags don't go in the opposite the direction the ship is going in. Flags go in the direction of the wind. So
yeah, well, in the game
yeah
they do from forward to backward, and also like back then they didn't really have these graphics. They had like, through rain, mist, like ships going.
Imagine the worst like $20 Walmart rifle scope that you've ever looked through, and that would be good quality optics for the time period. It's so you're not going to be able to see very much. And so that was like it was a valid concept, but it kind of forced them to make design decisions that that other nations probably wouldn't make. Because they wanted to rigidly hold to this sort of symmetrical design process. You can see later on in life they ditch this idea in order to make things more common sense.
Should I fire up the Cavour real quick to actually
go
for a battle, just to see this design? And is there a historical commander that was actually in Cavour?
I don't know. I don't know offhand.
Okay, that's fine. I'll go with Yatsin.
Yeah. And so another thing is almost all the Italian dreadnoughts had submerged torpedo tubes as built. However, they were all removed in 1914 to 1916.
Basically, were they able to actually aim them, or were they?
No. Well, you can set the torpedoes to go in a direction you want them to go to, but you can't move the torpedo tube itself. And so, but they found that essentially they were not able to really, they weren't useful at all. So, and they proved, and some evidence was there to say that they were more of a vulnerability in the ship than they were an asset. So most people got rid of them.
So basically, their hit rate was non-existent, and they thought, oh, but if someone hits us in the torpedoes, we have a problem.
Yeah, which happened more than there was one battleship torpedo hit, very likely in history, and there were more hits to torpedo rooms than that for sure.
Yeah,
not
a good trade.
Yeah, and at least one ship completely lost because it got hit in the torpedo room. Did any navies incorporate a way to divert exhaust in a way to mask direction of travel? I understand the exhaust smoke concept, but did anyone develop a more passive system? So to divert exhaust in a way to mask the direction of travel, no, not really. They would design funnels to where they looked like they were, they didn't give any information of which direction they were going in. This is why like angled funnels, where it's like angled back in kind of like a speedy like way, like you would see on like an ocean liner. You don't see that appear until kind of like the 1920s when things get further on, and it's just more worth the performance benefit of having angled funnels than having straight funnels. But besides that, nobody really does design that. A little bit for carriers, but that's for the reason to keep smoke from getting onto the deck. And France does design funnels in the 1940s or late 1930s. They designed some funnels that could rotate, so you could put the smoke on one side of the ship or the other, but that was for the purpose of avoiding smoke covering up fire control systems and not for hiding the smoke, if that makes sense.
I'm trying to showcase the battleships. My keys are getting stolen. It's fine.
And so the guns on these ships are a Ellswick design, which means that the origin of the gun design is from the UK. They are a 305 millimeter 12-inch gun with a caliber length of 45 calibers. They are a completely normal 12-inch gun for this period of time. 840 meters per second velocity, reasonable weight shell. They're kind of just a normal 12-inch gun for this point in time. We don't see the very, very high velocity guns until later. And so another thing to note is Dante Alighieri, the last note, is she was quite fast for the time. She was 22 to 23 knots, where most battleships were still cruising around at 21-ish knots. So having a knot or two advantage is not incredible, but it is a small advantage in the long term, especially
it
when
adds up.
Yeah, so like it's not going to help you tactically in a battle really, but it will help you strategically in terms of getting ships where you need to go. A little bit.
A faster response, I guess, to whatever is happening as well.
Yeah. The
Because you can fire more shots if you show up earlier, right? Wait, what's my secondary
Yeah.
range?
And to answer all the submarine questions at this point in time, there are no plans for submarines. No plans.
This
So
is
you're not gonna see them anytime soon. So
this is an Italian battleship strip.
yeah, and we're focusing on Italian battleships, and we shall move on to Conte di Cavour, which is the kind of the second attempt at Italian battleships. Essentially, what happens is the by the time Dante Alighieri comes online, the Austro-Hungarians already have their battleships coming online as well. And if you've ever seen the Viribus Unitas in game, you know that it has a very modern turret setup with basically two triples up front and two triples in the back, and they can fire in almost. They have very, very good firing angles, and you can fire 6 guns forward and 6 guns backwards. Dante Alighieri can only fire 3 guns forward and 3 guns backwards, so they want to make a critical improvement in forward and rearward firepower.
Also, maneuverability, incredibly good, right? Even back in the day, maybe.
Yeah, the maneuverability on these ships was decent. Nothing to write home about.
Decent enough to dodge storms.
Indeed. They actually had an interesting rudder arrangement on these ships where they had 2 rudders kind of back to back, or rather in line with each other. So you have your 2 propellers, essentially 2 propellers, and then you had rudder and rudder. The backup rudder wasn't enough to override the main rudder if it got jammed, but it would help. The only other nation I'm aware of that did this double rudder setup is I think the Russians may have done it once or twice, and then Yamato also had a double rudder setup like this. Next time have a drawing for us. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm not good.
Live droid.
I need a whiteboard.
But that can be arranged.
Actually, yeah, it probably could be. But so they want to improve the forward and rearward firing of Dante Alighieri, and so they developed the Conte di Cavour and Giulio class of battleships. And so there were 3 of these ships: Conte di Cavour, Giulio Cesare or Julio Cesare. And
Giulio, I think.
and Leonardo.
Please, if we have any Italians in the chat, let us know. But I think it's Giulio.
And also the 3rd ship was Leonardo da Vinci. These 3 ships are completed during World War I, and are essentially they have an arrangement of guns which is 3-2-3-2-3, which gives them a total of 13 guns on the broadside, and 5 firing forward and 5 firing rearward. Which gives them, it doesn't bring them on par with the Austro-Hungarian ships, but brings them into the ballpark 5 versus 6 guns forward and aft, which for the time people were quite worried about being able to fire while running or fire while chasing. Turns out throughout history it's not as relevant as people make it out to be in real life combat, but it is, of course, always helpful.
Talking about real life combat, we discussed about guns getting disabled. My guns are getting quite disabled.
Yes, the armor protection on the gun turrets and in general on these ships is nothing to write home about. The armor protection does get improved a little bit with the Conte di Cavour class, and it takes up like, I think, 23% of the displacement, but it's not significantly better. It's mostly the same, just kind of there's more ships, so there's more coverage of the ship.
There is a very poor Fuso, by the way, in the game that's being approached by 3 destroyers.
Dum,
Yeah,
dum,
this is
dum, dum. Cue the Jaws theme.
pretty much. What are the destroyers? No, it's a Kamikaze and the Hatsu. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Fuso's not gonna have fun.
Yeah, and so whenever the Cavour class got online, the Navy was quite satisfied with them, so they ordered 2 more of a slightly improved design, which was the Duilio class, and the which a lot of people call the Duilio Caio Duilio. Originally, she didn't have the Caio prefix. But later on, she gets it added to her name.
What is Caio?
Caio is like...
It sounds Italian. I'm not sure if it's Italian.
It's either Italian or Latin.
If someone knows in the chat what Caio means, please let us know. If you have any Italians. I think we do have a few.
It's
so help out.
Yeah, Caio. But it's named after somebody. And the... So you have Duilio and Andrea Doria. So essentially, when it comes to Italian dreadnoughts, you have Dante Alighieri on its own. Then you have kind of the C class, which is Cavour and Cesare and Leonardo da Vinci, and then you have the D class, which is Duilio and Duilio and Doria. That's how I keep things straight in my mind. The main noticeable difference between the Cavours and the Duilios is the central gun was the central gun. So the triple turret in the middle of the ship was lowered by 1 deck leg height, so that it would improve the ship's stability some. That's really the only main difference between the two. There were some minor changes to the secondary battery. Basically, they upgraded from 120 millimeter guns to 152 millimeter guns, and some minor armor improvements. Yeah.
In the meantime, since we are at around this era of battleships, I think I should try a game in the Giulio Cesare.
Yep, go for it.
Once again, I do have Moon Festival, but I think Giuseppe Verdi is the more appropriate option. And I'm running my standard Yacino with Cunningham, Sunhorst, and like 2-2-2, 3, and 2-2-2-1 and 3. Basically, just accuracy all the way, and yeah.
Yeah, and so Caio Duilio is the Italian version of her name of the Roman general who fought in the Carthaginian Wars. Thank you, Stephen. And so Ezra asks, is there any meaning why they added the red-white lines on every Italian battle deck on the battleships and the cruisers before/during World War II? Probably just cosmetics. It is that is a friendly fire, identify friend or foe method for aircraft. So after the Battle of Punta Stilo, also known as the Battle of Calabria, while the Italian ships were returning to Italy, they got attacked by Italian aircraft, and so which friendly fire is never cool and it's never friendly. And so the Italian Navy painted this pattern on the nose of all their ships so that Italian aircraft and enemy aircraft, for that matter, would know, hey, this is an Italian ship. Please don't attack me. Which is the purpose of it. It's kind of like the Germans would paint their turrets different colors based off of, or based off of where they were. This is where like the yellow turret Bismarck comes from. The Germans had a whole system of different colors for different parts of the ocean that they would paint it. So like the Baltic was like red, and the kind of the Middle Atlantic was yellow. And so that's the reason for the red-white stripe.
I also think it was for aircraft as well, right?
Yeah, it's for aircraft, identify friend foe, essentially.
Because like obviously, friendly aircraft won't see a blue bar above your ship. Like they will just see a ship and they don't know if they should bomb it or not.
Yeah. And an interesting thing about the Duilio is that one of the things that they try to keep as a tradition in the Italian Navy is to keep the name badge from ships. They try to pass it on. So the Duilio's name badge was from an earlier battleship named Duilio. And so they brought it over to the ship, but it's actually spelled wrong. So the name badge on Duilio does not match the official documents for the ship. So because essentially at the time you could use V or U interchangeably. So the name badge uses a V while all official documents use a U. But it's just a funny side note. So if you ever see in documents talking about these ships or maybe in photographs, that's why it's spelled a little bit differently. And so let's see. So all of these ships had mottos. So they at least from this era in time. So they would just kind of have something that kind of described the ethos of the ship, what it was about. Giulio Cesare had a couple of them. At first, it was I'm not even going to try to pronounce this in Italian, but well, actually no, this is Latin. But basically, Cesare's original was to withstand any blow, and then they changed it in 1920 to Caesar is here. Or Kaiser Adest. The Leonardo da Vinci, their motto was, he who is fixed to a star does not change his mind. So that's kind of like the principle of inflexibility or determination. And then after Leonardo da Vinci would eventually essentially be irreparably damaged. If I remember right, she explodes in harbor, or no, she hits a naval mine, and essentially Leonardo da Vinci, which is why she isn't in World War II. She gets scrapped, but whenever they tried to salvage her, they changed her motto to every wrong is righted. So they
fixed her up, or
we'll fix it.
We can fix her.
We can fix her, except they didn't. Kyle Giulio, their motto was Nomen Numen, which is essentially basically the name of power, or the name is power. And the Andrea Doria had striving higher as their motto. So it's kind of sort of unique for the Italian Navy to have mottos. Other navies do have kind of like a motto system for some ships or sayings that they have, but it's not as formal as it is in the Italian Navy. The protection of these ships are all still generally focused on protection against high explosive, but throughout the war they see armor piercing is a real threat, especially Battle of Jutland experiences shared from the Royal Navy. And so they start realizing, maybe for our next ships we need to make improvements here. The fire control on the Cavours and the Duilios was improved, but it was not up to par with the other navies at this point in time. And so this brings us to kind of the 1920s in the Italian Navy, which is essentially the year of, as for budget, we don't have any budget.
In terms of budget, there is no budget.
Yeah, and so the Italian Navy in general begins to struggle for
Budget.
and by 1928 they have put into reserve all of the battleships by 1928. So there is a period of time for essentially from 1928 to basically 1936 where the Italian Navy effectively does not have any battleships. They have some that they're working on, but they're all out of service. Of course, Dante Alighieri gets scrapped in 26, and the other battleships are slowly put into reserve over time. There were some minor improvements throughout the 20s, but nothing massive to make big improvements, and so they were kind of
We
put
do
on
have
the
some
back burner.
story, like in overview as well, guys. If you're more interested and want to remember some of the stuff we talk about here, you can usually find a lot of facts or a small text about them, like the Andrea Doria that I'm gonna just play next, while we move on in history, in the timeline of Italian battleships again.
Yep.
Same build with the Azzino.
Do we want to go to the Caracciolo, which they start building but don't ever complete, or do we want to go on to the refits of the other ships that they do in the 30s? I think probably Caracciolo.
We can do Caracciolo. With,
So we will come back to the Cavours and the Duilios basically next, because they get massive rebuilds on life later in the 30s, but we have to work up to there first. During World War I, Italy begins project on their next series of battleships, and they want to go for the full house. They want to kind of leapfrog the competition and build something entirely new and far more powerful. And this starts the design process that is the Francesco Caracciolo class. And this, which in game, she is modernized like the other dreadnoughts would end up being. The original version would be much simpler looking than this, with the different superstructure and different secondaries. But the overall concept is the same. They ended up with a ship with 8 15-inch guns and a quite high speed and decent protection for the time period. Essentially what happens is in 1911, 1912, the 13.5-inch super dreadnoughts come in online, which is the Orion class, and also like Congo in the Japanese Navy. And so Italy needs to catch up and join the super dreadnought era. And especially the problem is the Britannia class of the French Navy, which come into service during World War I. And also in 1912, rumors come from the Austro-Hungarian Empire that they were going to build a battleship with 12 14-inch guns, 356 millimeter guns.
In what arrangement do you know?
It would have been in like the Tegethoff arrangement, but that was just a rumor at that point in time. In fact, the Austro-Hungarian battleship that they ended up trying to develop ended up being 10 guns in basically triple, twin, triple.
3, 2, 2, 3.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so, but that never, if you want to look up that class of ship, it's called the Ersatz Monarch, but they never got into service. So, with both France and the Austro-Hungarian Empire developing super dreadnoughts, Italy had to join and beat them. And so the approval was formally given in 1912 to start work on 15-inch gun ships. So we're just going to leapfrog, go beyond 13.5, go beyond 14. We're going to go straight to 15, and which is 381 millimeter. And so there were two projects of battleships. There was a Ferrati battleship project, and the Cuniberti, Vittorio Cuniberti, returns. He submits a battleship project, but Ferrati wins. And
Was
so
it like how was it? I know these are very specific questions, but I'm just
Yep.
curious. We both had an idea, had a concept, have very rough plans of what they wanted on a battleship.
Yep.
With I guess some indications on cost because you don't actually know how much. Like
Yep.
historically, like budget was just a very sparingly used number.
Yeah.
Like this may cost like 20 million, like, not 20 million, but it might end up costing like 70, and we'll know halfway. So how was the decision made on whose design is going to get picked up?
Essentially, they weigh of course they weigh the costs of the design into the equation, but also your admiralty board are going to come up with goals that you have to meet with your design, which are going to be like, we want this many guns of this size, we want this much speed, we want this much armor, we want the secondaries to be able to do this. We want to have torpedoes, we want to have aircraft, we want to have anti-aircraft, we want to have all these different factors in the ship. And so you'll have a design, or your design teams build up basically drafts, talk with the engineering teams, talk with the gun makers. Basically, everybody gets together and kind of is like, what is reasonable? And then they piece it together into a package. And so whichever package people like more or get bribed to like more,
Perhaps, yeah.
ends up winning.
So follow-up question, because my business mind is kicking in now.
Yeah.
Say you are one of those designers and your design actually gets picked. Apart from obviously helping your country and contributing to the country's defense and making sure the country is as well equipped as possible, what else was your benefit? Like, did you get part of the money? Like, did you get a salary to head the project?
So depends on whether or not you are a private individual or a career individual. Essentially, but for the Italian Navy, at least at this point in time, it's going to be all career designers. So essentially you get, a successful project. And so maybe you get a promotion from lieutenant commander to captain or to full commander or to captain or something like this. And so it's essentially just part of your service, because these are Navy personnel. But for the companies making the guns or making the engines or they get a contract. Then that's their goal.
Okay, I see.
And so
speaking of Caracciolo, should I get into a game? Yeah. Before we continue, just a quick look. This is going to be the first battleship I'm going to attempt playing with secondary guns. Quick note on both Caracciolo and Veneto. I personally prefer to use secondaries. This is my full build. There is it's absolutely fine if you choose to play for main guns. I just find secondaries to be more fun for me. So feel free to experiment, try your own build out. This is how we're trying out the ships. Just a very standard secondary build with the Revel. And of course, I have Iron Blood, but let's go through Giuseppe Verdi just to keep me in the team. And let's do it.
All right. So with the Caracciolo designs, they kind of do a little competition, and they want to have a notable amount of superiority over any battleships are at the time, because they're basically like, we have a limited budget. We have talented engineers. And we want to beat everything that's going to be around in 4 or 5 years. So they're looking at ahead, like, what's going to be done in 5 years? And we want to have something that either has superiority or is equal to that. And they're talking about this in 1913. So in 4 or 5 years, looking at 1917. So the new ships of that time is the Queen Elizabeth class. And what they have on paper is superior to the Queen Elizabeths. So pretty good project, I'd say, on paper.
Small note, 7.9 kilometer secondaries. We're going to try to get as close as possible without completely throwing our ship away.
Yep.
See how that goes. And we're going to try and use the smoke.
Yep. And so the Ferrati design comes out as the winner of the competition. The original design is 35,000 tons. And it goes 28 knots, which this is 1913, so 28 knots is far faster than any ship in service, essentially, and it's faster than a lot of the battle cruisers, if not most of the battle cruisers. And also has 12 at this time, 12 381 millimeter guns. So that would be 4 triple turrets. However, essentially and this is the ship that wins the competition. And there is other competition as well from the Ansaldo Company, the Orlando Company, and also other naval designers. But Frati uses his experience helping with the design of the Cavour and the Duilio class to win the competition. And another notable thing is, this is 1913. They're probably the first nation to seriously investigate protection against armor-piercing aircraft bombs. So they took a look at like, hey, this bomber thing might become a real thing. We need to look into protecting our deck against bombs from aircraft. And so they actually do experimentation in 1913, 1914 to see how can we protect our ships against bombs, which is kind of mind-blowing that they foresee that already. And so they have a total budget for these ships. They want to build 4 of them. They have a total budget of 400 million lira, which is the currency they were using in Italy at the time.
Which in today's money is a lot of lira.
Yes. Mini euro. And so but the problem is that the original design with 12 guns would cost 120 million euro a piece. So they had to tone it down some. And in order to do that, they reduced the armament first and foremost to 8 guns. So sadly, we didn't get the 12-gun Caracciolo. And they reduced the overall displacement down to 31,000 tons, 8 instead of 12 guns, but they kept the speed at 28 knots because, got to go fast. And they also reduced the secondary armament. Basically, the number of 152 millimeter guns was decreased. Another thing is that these ships were going to be all oil fired instead of some kind of a mix between oil fire and coal fire. These were going to be completely oil fired ships with geared turbines, which essentially is the first generation turbines on battleships were basically all or nothing, and so your fuel consumption was always high with these ships, and the turbines were basically always going fast, and you did not have a reliable cruising speed. So so eventually geared turbines came out, so you basically had multiple gears, basically a cruising gear and a high-speed gear. So was there a reason to go from 4x3 to 4x2 instead of 3x3 for the Caracciolo? So at the time, 3x3 was unusual. Italy is actually the first country to develop a ship with a 3x3 armament for a battleship, and with the Littorios. And so it would have been unusual at the time to kind of sacrifice rearward firepower, and also doing that requires hull design, which probably wasn't developed at that point in time, because the shape of your hull is very very dependent on the placement of your turrets and the placement of your superstructure in terms of getting a hydrodynamic shape. And it was very easy to develop that shape, relatively speaking, for a new ship with 4 guns or 4 turrets than it was for 3 turrets. And so that development comes later on in the battleship design, and also developing since they were already using twin gun or triple gun turrets, it probably wouldn't be that bad, but it might be more expensive for them to develop the turrets for a triple. So that's why they didn't really go for that. They ordered 4 of these ships in 1914, but 3 of them were canceled in 1916. The Caracciolo herself is the only one that continues construction, but very slowly throughout the war. And she's kind of kept around until 1921, when Italy is after World War One, Italy, like basically all the European nations, are not in a financially stable condition, and so they cannot be affording to spend money on battleships. And also, by 1921, the Caracciolo is a 7-year-old design, so they're kind of like, do we go in for the sunk cost fallacy and keep building this thing that's already old and almost out of date, or do we just scrap it and then see what we can do? And at the same time, you're looking at the Washington Naval Treaty, which Italy does join the Washington Naval Treaty. So it's more advantageous for them just to get rid of the ship. They do look into converting the ship into an aircraft carrier, but decide against it because they figure we're in the Mediterranean. Land-based aircrafts can reach everywhere in the Mediterranean, or
much, yeah.
everywhere that we need them to. So they skip the aircraft carrier concept for the ship. She has, or the Caracciolo design has a few unique features as well. Additionally, her turrets are evenly spaced, and so they are not like stacked close together, which you can see especially on the rear turrets. And then the idea behind that is to keep the basically one hit from detonating more than one magazine, and to increase the protection there. That comes at the cost of weight, because you need a larger citadel to cover it. They're not the only nation to do that. Japan kind of does it a little bit with the Fuso class, and the Imperial Russian Navy does it as well with Gangut and the Imperatsia Maria class. They also have triple bottom hulls at the magazines.
The ones we talked about before, right?
Right, and which is and incredible longitudinal strength. Essentially, they build the armor into the longitudinal structure of the ship. So these would have been very rigid and strong ships, maybe a little brittle, but that would have been good. And then also they had a relatively modern for the time torpedo protection system, which is so that would have been quite notable at that point in time. It was basically a multi-layer protection system you would see in like the U.S. Navy at the time. But protection, again, is very small. It's only 22% of the whole displacement of the ship. Again, you're looking at like a reasonably armored ships is going to have basically 25, 26, 27% or higher. And really well-protected ships are going to be in the excess of like 32%. So like HMS Hood, which is quote-unquote a like poorly armored battle cruiser in some documentaries, has like over 30% of her armor in displacement. So, or displacement in armor. So for context here is like Hood is a similar ship to this and has almost 10% more of her weight in armor and is a heavier ship. And so so for considering the time period that she was designed in 1914, which is before all the World War I lessons were learned, she would have been quite notable. But by the time that she would have been completed, considering history would have been like 1923 probably, she would have been well and truly out of date. She has a unique, or she would have had a unique 381 millimeter gun, which was a 300 millimeter or 381/40 caliber gun. So, which is not a copy of the British gun. It is a British gun, but it is not a copy of the 42. It is a separate gun that they brought privately and had developed so that they could build it within Italy. And essentially their whole design concept with that gun is heavy shell going quite slow. Would have been 700 meters per second, and which, for context, the slowest battleship gun in World of Warships Legends is the North Carolina's guns and the Massachusetts and Alabama's guns, which are 701 meters per second. So it's, big heavy shell going quite slow. And so that was the idea behind it. The Italian guns tend to be quite a lightweight gun. The Vickers version of this gun was an 85-ton gun, while the Italian variant of it, the Ansaldo variant, was a 63-ton gun. So somehow the Italians really figured out a way and also liked to lighten the weight of their guns as much as possible. And this might be a contributing factor towards Italian gun dispersion issues, but nothing is certain there. What is the fastest projectile in the game? Fastest projectiles in the game go 1,000 meters per second. The Akazuki gun firing armor piercing goes 1,000 meters per second, but it loses that velocity very fast.
I thought it was going to be Stalingrad, actually.
In practical long distance firing, Stalingrad, yeah. Yeah, like which is 950 meters per second. So the Caracciolos get canceled. We have her depicted in game with a substantial modernization, similar to how the Italian dreadnoughts would be modernized. So essentially, the turrets are redone, the guns are new. So she has the long barrel 381 millimeter guns that you see on the Veneto or Littorio class. And the superstructure is completely redone. So it doesn't look like it would have looked like when she was completed, but it is the same core. Yeah, and the 380-150 is a completely different gun. As the conversation in the chat between the 380-140 and the 380-150s, they're two completely different guns, but essentially some of the tools that were used to make the 380-140s could be used to make 380-150s. Things like a lathe. If you have a lathe that's designed to cut a 15-inch barrel, it's still going to work on a longer gun. But you're still going to need entirely different designs in terms of how long you're going to make it, how you're going to support the weight throughout the length of the gun. The whole engineering is going to be different for that gun. It's just you could reuse some of the tools that you already had, which was the idea behind it. And making the tools for a substantial production process is usually going to be the longest part of that process. So like you can be France and design a new rifle in 6 to 8 months, but it's going to take you 3 years to develop the tools to mass produce the rifles. So that's the Caracciolo class.
Don't have any questions, but I did catch someone in the chat ask us about our favorite Italian battleship. And I do think that someone needs to remind us this question towards the end of the stream, after we go through all of them, because we still have some to go that were both historical and also designs.
Yeah. And so after Caracciolo, Italy joins the Washington Naval Treaty, which the Washington Naval Treaty is a favorite Italian ship. Give you a reason why. We'll do that later in the stream.
Yeah.
And so the Washington Naval Treaty was basically all of the major navies of the world, the five leading navies at that point in time, which would be U.S. or UK Navy, U.S. Navy, Japanese Navy, French Navy, and Italian navies. They all got together, and their politicians got together to draft a contract together, basically stopping the battleship design race, putting a stop on battleship production for 10 years, and putting limitations on future battleship production. So the Italians were satisfied just to stop the race because they didn't have the money to spend on the race, and also just be equal with France. France did not like this, but had to accept it anyway. And so Italy and France were put at the bottom tier of the Washington Navy Treaty powders, but they were both allowed to build new battleships up to 70,000 tons. So that means you could either get You could either get two 35,000-ton battleships, new build, in the 20s, or you could get three 23,000-ton battleships, or four 17,500-ton battleships. And so each of the navies developed their own, or tried to figure out ways that they could satisfactorily build a battleship within these tonnage limitations, but nobody actually springs and does it, because essentially both France and Italy don't have the money to spend on this. They have to rebuild after the war and get their economies going and pay off debts to other nations. And so this Washington Naval Treaty still sets that limitation of 70,000 tons. So we have to fit however many battleships we want to have within that, and also have to have those ships be capable of dealing with enemy threats, particularly French threats. Austro-Hungary is no longer a threat up at this point in time. So essentially, the Italian Navy is only looking at France and the UK. Let me see here that I'm not mixing anything. I know I have some notes that I need to jump around for.
But before you continue, are we in the range to start playing a bit of Vittorio Veneto?
No, not yet. We're in the basically
in the in-between time.
Yeah, the Cavour and not the Cavour, Cesare and Andrea Doria.
Mm-hmm.
So throughout the 1920s, essentially, 1920s, they do a little bit of testing and modernization, small refits basically to the battleships. Basically, they add tripod masts to most of the battleships instead of the single pole mast, so that they can get more weight in fire control systems and improve fire control systems. And then all of the battleships are either scrapped or put into reserve by 1928. And then France is still kind of just like puddling along, basically doing the same thing with their dreadnoughts. They're not developing anything new. And so there's kind of this mutual agreement between Italy and France where they're just like, we could build battleships, but ain't nobody got time or money for that. So they just keep designing ships, but they don't actually do anything through this whole 10-year time period. And this continues on basically until 1920 or 1930, London Naval Treaty extends the battleship holiday, or the battleship don't build battleships again. They extend that for another 5 years in 1930. Italy and France keep their rights to build battleships, but that 1930 treaty shows that at least the UK is interested in further making smaller ships. So that kind of encourages, or rather, the France and the Italians are encouraged to look into build smaller battleships, please. Don't start big. And so both of the navies are looking at 23,000 ton battleships, maybe up to 26,000 tons. And then the Germans throw a wrench into the whole works, as they tend to do. And the Deutschland class pocket battleships, as they're called, come out online in the early 1930s. And so basically everybody's like, unga bunga, we have to make some kind of solution to this problem. And
they put a battleship gun on a cruiser.
What? And so Britain is sitting fat and happy. They've got at this point in time 4 battle cruisers basically. Repulse, Renown, Hood, and if they really wanted it, they could have Tiger in service. And so they're just like, yeah, we have ships that can deal with this. No worries about it. The Japanese have the Congos. They can deal with it. If they would ever need to. The Americans are sweating with all their 21 knot battleships, and and then France is also sweating with their nominally 21 knot battleships, which
we're trying.
In reality we're not. And so France basically pulls the trigger and says, 26,500 ton battleship, we're building Dunkirk. And so this forces Italy to make a decision. Do we work on building a ship to match Dunkirk? or do we modernize our old dreadnoughts? And so their options that they're looking at this point in time is a basically 23,000 gun ships with 6, 15, or 16-inch guns, just 6 of them, about 28 knots, and armored against 15 or 16-inch guns. And so they're looking at basically small, compact battleships with very limited firepower. They also look into basically building matches to the Dunkirks. So ships with 6 or 8 13.5-inch guns, so 343 millimeter. And most of these are going to be in twin turrets with 2 turrets up front and 1 in the back. They don't really go for the quadruple gun turret or anything like this. There is one or 2 designs where basically they build a bigger, better grasp bay, which are the 18,000 ton series, where they basically say, we'll put 343 millimeter guns in triple turrets forward and aft, and then cover the rest in secondaries. But all of these designs are not satisfactory to the Italian Navy. They don't feel like that would give them an advantage over Dunkirk, and would not be sufficient against basically any Royal Navy opponents. So these were essentially none of them were enjoyed. So this series of designs are almost all scrapped, or basically all scrapped, and they decide we're going to modernize our dreadnoughts. This turns out to probably be a mistake, because it takes them just about as long to modernize, or takes them basically about the same amount of time to modernize the dreadnoughts, and about the same amount of money to modernize the dreadnoughts as it would have been to make the new ships. So,
not stonks.
Yeah, it's one of the very debated issues where basically people are like, this was a mistake or this was correct.
But did they know it beforehand, or they were trying to refit them and modernize them, and halfway through they're like, oh god, this is getting expensive, oh my god, this is quite time consuming, and it's gonna take a lot of years?
My understanding is that it's the second. It took longer than expected and costed more than expected.
So it wasn't the plan. The plan was, it's gonna be fast, it's gonna be cheap, and it's gonna be enough.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, answer a quick question. Can you tell me perhaps why the Genoa doesn't have the diagonal red-white lines while other Italian ships do? This is mostly because Genoa is an old ship design that was not built. So ships that were in service during World War II have this stripe, or would have been in service during World War II. So the Genoa is a paper ship. Only the Doria the Cavours are rightfully seen as a good investment. That is still debatable. Especially the Doria, like Andrea Doria and Duilio. Basically, what they do is, with the modernization of the dreadnoughts, they do it in two groups. So they do the first 2, Cavour and Cesare, which is why they look different a little bit. So if you look at Cesare, pull up Cesare.
Wait, it moves because it has my recently played ships. Yeah.
Yeah, and so basically the secondary armament on these ships are entirely different. So that's Cesare, and then go look at Doria.
Yeah.
So the Doria has the 90 millimeter guns, basically more anti-aircraft, and then the triple 135 millimeter guns. And so what happens is they order the first 2, and then they decide, well, let's order the second 2 modernized as well. And so they do 2 batches of modernizations. And these are extreme modernizations. These are arguably, or maybe not even arguably, these are the most extreme modernizations of battleships going into World War II. They basically scrap and rebuild 60% of the hull of these ships And as you can see, if you compare Cesare versus Cavour, the silhouette is entirely changed. The hull shape is changed. The armament is also upgraded. So they go from 305 millimeter guns to 320 millimeter guns. They basically take the gun and they just basically cut it to be a wider gun to the extent of what the barrel can withstand. This increases their firepower by about 20 to 30%, which is a big step up, but it still doesn't make them competitive with World War II guns. They redo the boiler rooms and the engines. Essentially, they go from being a 4 propeller shaft arrangement to a 2 propeller shaft arrangement, but they increase the speed up to 27-ish knots on these ships. So you go from basically 22-ish knots to 27-knot ships. The speed regimens of all Italian battleships, all of them, is questionable because they always did ship speed trials with light loads, sometimes without the turrets installed, because usually what happens is that they would modernize the ships in the south of Italy, and then they would sail them north to Italy where they built the guns and put them on there, and they would do the speed trials while they were sailing to the north.
And why was that? Is it to
It's the location of factories.
create excitement, I guess? Like, was it to meet specifications? Was it to...
It's a mixture of meet specifications because many times in naval contracts, you would have a specific speed that you must meet in order to get all your money.
And that's your best shot at actually getting that.
Yeah.
So why not?
And also propaganda factors. Then you can publicize, hey, we've got ships that can go 28 knots and you only have ships that go 21 knots. Ha ha.
Well, ours won't have the guns, but...
Yeah. And
They can still
but like realistically, whenever they get the ships, they get the guns and armament added back to the ships, they only lose maybe a knot. It's notable, but it's not huge. And the reason that they were building the guns in the north is essentially it's basically the way that Italy works is that the majority of Italian heavy industry happens in the north of Italy. And this is because Italy at the time was powered by what they called white coal. It's almost entirely hydroelectric power. And so white coal is literally water.
Okay.
And so the rest of the world, the UK and whatnot, they're building all their factories and they're coal powered, steam powered. And then Italy was using a lot of hydroelectric and just hydropower in general. North Italy at this time is just covered in dams and factories built near them. And so, which is one thing, it's like Italy is not reliant on coal or reliant on British exports of coal during World War One, which is something that British historians may tell you, and they are wrong. And so these ships were heavily modernized. So again, 60% of their hulls are replaced, which is insane because essentially nobody else does anything like this. The closest that you get is like the American dreadnoughts that are modernized after Pearl Harbor, but even then they just kind of add to the hull. They don't really rebuild the hull in the same way, and they don't change out the engineering plans. And so they the rebuilding these ships makes it time to introduce our second personality in Italian battleship design, is Umberto Pugliese. I'm sorry if I
No, I think that's pretty accurate.
yeah, and so Umberto Pugliese is a extremely talented ship designer and engineer from Italy. And he's most famous for the development of the torpedo defense system named after him, even though which they use in all modern, or basically all the World War II Italian battleships have this torpedo defense system, and the Soviet Sovetski Soyuz class battleships have it. Technically, they shouldn't, but the Soviets probably stole it or got it somehow else. But because it wasn't part of their technology exchange deal. But he was a brilliant engineer. Started in 1901. He kind of worked through the Italian Navy, did some service, and did a lot of engineering work for them. Helped with the development of earlier battleships, but really wasn't a senior engineer at that time. He served under Ferrati, who was the guy that designed the Caracciolo's. Also, he is notable for designing the new superstructure that you see on Italian ships. So if you actually go over to the cruisers real quick and look at...
I'm not sure I have all the cruisers.
It's okay. Just hop on over to Gisano.
I actually have Gisano.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then, so Gisano has the old style superstructure. And then if you go to Montecacoli, she has the new style of superstructure. So that bridge, like that cone-shaped bridge that you see here, that is the work of Umberto Pugliese. It's essentially they get rid of the conning tower idea and they go with the kind of armored shell idea of conning towers that the UK also followed. And it's a much more modern and more spacious system, or in terms of efficient use of space.
It looks more clean.
And and it's very clean and aesthetic. He is a large reason why the Italian ships look so good during World War II.
Can't argue with that, to be honest.
This tower design was also adopted by the USSR. Umberto Pugliese, essentially, he is the project leader for the modernizations of the battleships and for the Littorio class battleships, but he is dismissed from Italian service in 1938 owing to his Jewish heritage. So Italy was also had was also a fascist power at this time, and also had laws against having people in service like this. So he gets dismissed in 1938 and doesn't contribute further to development. He does do some private work for Ansaldo at this point in time, but he's no longer in official Italian Navy service. But after the attack on Taranto, they actually call him, which results in the damaging of many of the Italian battleships. Basically, it proves that aircraft can attack a harbor or a port and successfully and sink battleships. The Italian Navy bring him back and basically like, hey, we need help. We need somebody that's a smart engineer that knows how to do salvage work. And so his requirement for his requirement for coming back to help them is that he gets to wear the uniform again and serve. And so they make a special exception for him. He serves for the rest of the war with distinction. He is captured by and escapes the German SS troops. And then basically he continues to influence naval architecture until 1961, serving in various different administrative and social roles. So Pugliese is a tremendous engineer that worked on basically all of these ships and develops a lot of the innovative solutions that we see during World War II. So while the French are building the Dunkirks, Italy goes to modernize the Cavours, which is basically a stopgap until they can get the proper new battleships online, which would eventually be the Littorio/Veneto class. Essentially, they determined early on that just a simple modernization would not be enough to make them relevant or effective. And so they would be too slow, they would have too little protection, and be underpowered overall. So their goal was to improve the offensive firepower, improve the protection, especially against torpedoes, improve their speed, and arrive with a balanced design in the end. And so they demolish and reconstruct 60% of the hull or of the ships for Cavour and Cesare. They replace the machinery entirely. They redo the armament. They increase the elevation of the armament of the guns. They increase the caliber of the guns. Well, the the size of the guns to 320 millimeters. They remake the hull with the Pugliese torpedo defense system, which I'll describe more in detail later. And they completely redo the superstructure and secondary armament. And it takes them 4 years to do this, which would be about the same time to build a new battleship, from 1933 to 1937. They basically they stick an add-on component to the end of the bow. So the original bow is still there, but they kind of stick a nose onto it that extends the bow by 10 meters. The central turret is removed on these ships, so they're now down to 10 guns. The horsepower of the ship is doubled, or more than doubled, from 31,000 to technically 75,000, but in reality over 80,000, or even over 90,000. The deck armor is improved from 40 millimeter to 100 millimeters of deck armor. The guns are rebored to 320 millimeters. The turrets are completely redone. The Pugliese cylinders or defense system is incorporated into the hull with no hydrodynamic loss, which means that they improve the hydrodynamics of the hull overall. But at this cost, they could have had one more Vittorio Veneto by 1940. So the cost of modernizing 2 of these ships is they could have had one more modern battleship by 1940. Which is kind of, and as a whole, I would have rather had the one extra ship. Or rather not one extra ship, but you would be down one ship, but you would have one vastly superior ship.
Yeah, but obviously at that time, like now that we are seeing the
this is
history
hindsight,
written, obviously it makes sense, but maybe things weren't that clear.
Of course.
That
Hindsight is 2020, and they made the decision that they could make at the time. And then in 1937, whenever they're getting towards the end of finishing off, or rather when they do finish off these modernizations, it's decided to also rebuild the Duilios. They have a completely different secondary and anti-aircraft arrangement. And this time they decide, instead of sticking on the nose or sticking on an extra bit to the nose of the bow, they completely replace the bow for the Duilios. Because essentially what happened is that the weight of essentially 2 bows was too heavy on the Cavours, and they became nose heavy in terms of their trim. So they wanted to reduce that weight so that they would be more efficient. Essentially, they have better anti-aircraft, they have better seakeeping, and they have better main battery range than the Cavours. They add a weirdness to it. I'm actually going to rob the controller real quick, because in order to describe this, I will need to show you something. So on these ships, they wanted to increase the armor of the barbettes. And so if we look at the barbettes, which are the circles that the turrets are mounted on top of, you can see this is the Cesare, is quite wide the barbette is compared to the turret. Where if we look at the Cavour, which is the same ship, but earlier, it's not as wide. What they did was they added a 50 millimeter layer with a space in between the original barbette and the outer 50 millimeter layer. This accidentally actually decreases the protection of the turret. Because essentially the shell can hit this thinner layer, normalize, become more, or rather less angled against the barbette, the interior barbette, and then hit it dead on. And so, and this was found out later on by some of the other Navy, or by the Royal Navy, who tried this with their battle cruisers. And so between Cesare has these thicker barbettes, while Doria, they incorporate this barbette armor directly onto the barbette itself, rather than having the space. So the barbettes are a little bit thinner on Doria than on Cesare. So that was one of the things that they changed between the 2 ships. And so this was essentially the modernization of these ships. They give pretty good service through World War II. Cesare, of course, goes on to serve after World War II in the Soviet Navy, as Novosibirsk, and then she is sunk in harbor somehow in 1956. Through World War II, they kind of see a bunch of little small skirmishes. Cavour gets critically damaged during Toronto and is basically out of the war from Toronto onward. And the Duilios and Doria just kind of hang around and do minor skirmishes. Cesare is the recipient of of one of the joint longest gunfire hits on a moving target in history. So Warspite shoots and hits Giulio Cesare at 26,000 yards.
How much is it in?
24 kilometers.
Okay.
And so, and that does minor damage to Cesare.
It's still a hit.
It's still a hit, but it does minor damage.
It still counts.
And so the other ship that has a similar long-range shooting record is Scharnhorst. Scharnhorst and Warspite are the two longest. And so these ships serve pretty well throughout the war, but they're essentially they're still always a step behind the enemy ships. They never have to face really any of the French battleships, but they do face the modernized British battleships, the Queen Elizabeths. So basically Queen Elizabeth and Warspite and Valiant. And so where they're essentially they're competitive, but they're essentially outmatched by these ships just because they don't have the protection needed really, and they don't really have the firepower really to compete with 15-inch gun battleships that are actually armored against 15-inch guns. So while all that modernization is going on, they look towards building their new ships. And what time is it, by the way? Oh, we're doing good. So it is 7. So didn't want to make sure we're running too long.
I'm fine.
Yeah.
I'm listening.
So they start developing the Vittorio Veneto or Littorio class. People call it both different classes. Both are correct. Call it whatever you want. For the purposes of the stream, I'm going to call it the Veneto class, just because that is the ship that we have in game. We have Veneto and we have Roma. There are 3 of these ships get completed, and they were building 4. So the Vittorio Veneto, Littorio, and Roma are completed. Roma is built in a second batch, so a second pair of them, and there were going to be Roma and Impero. Impero is never completed. Roma is completed, but does not see very much action during the war because it's a little bit later to the party.
Speaking of Roma, I will get into a battle with her just to see her in our game too. Just quick look at commander builds again: Cunningham, Scharnhorst, and 2-2-2-1-3 with Testudo. Obviously, flag is going to be Giuseppe Verdi.
Yeah.
And we have the Type 9 camo. So while we are talking about the ships, let's just throw in a battle.
And so when Dunkirk comes around, they and the Deutschland class pocket battleship cruisers come around. Italy develops some designs that are 6 guns with 343 millimeter guns in triple turrets, but they are not really satisfied with them. Interestingly, these ships returned to the submerged torpedo idea, but that doesn't go anywhere. But they were deemed to be impractical because they're 18,000-ton small battleships that don't really do very much and are not at all protected. And so they form the basis, especially the machinery basis, for the Littorio class battleships. And so they decide they need a Dunkirk counter and they need to build something that's going to be relevant in the future. So they decide on going up to maybe 26,500 tons. And so that would give them 4 twin 13.5-inch guns, which in a very normal 4x2 arrangement, 2 front, 2 back, 29 knots with a 10-inch belt again, and a 6-inch deck split between 3 decks, which is not efficient, but that's the design they had at the time. They abandoned this 26,500 ton design to go for the full bird, 35,000 tons, because legally speaking, they couldn't get more than 2 26,000 ton ships. So instead of getting 2 smaller ships, might as well get 2 of the largest ships you can get. And so they go up for 35,000 tons and modernize the dreadnoughts. And so they quickly settle on the 381 millimeter gun caliber because they already have the tooling to make some of the parts for these guns. So they are they consider, or they would have liked to be able to go for 406 millimeter guns, especially Mussolini wanted to have large caliber guns, but practically speaking, they would not be able to get those guns out in time, and Italy had never developed a gun that large before. So they stuck with more or less what they knew, what they had tools for, and developed a very high velocity, very powerful 381 millimeter gun. And this gun is extremely powerful. I don't think it can be really overstated how absurd this gun is. So this, for context here, this gun has the 3rd highest muzzle penetration of any gun in World War II. The second highest being the American 16-inch 50 gun, and the top highest being the Yamato gun. And it's in the ballpark of these guns. So the Yamato gun can penetrate like 34 inches of armor at the muzzle. The American gun can penetrate 32.5 inches, and the Italian gun can penetrate 32 inches of armor at the muzzle. So it was a 15-inch gun firing a very heavy shell at very high velocities. But that came at the cost of basically the worst barrel life of battleship guns, where it was basically only 100 to 150 rounds per gun lifetime before they would become horrendously inaccurate. So and dangerous to use at that point. So they had very low barrel life, but they were exceptionally powerful. They are also the longest range guns in World War II.
In what range do you know?
They were able to fire to 40. I can't remember what the number is. It's like 45 kilometers, basically, in real life. And this is not even so. For context here, Yamato can fire basically like 1 kilometer shorter range at 45 degrees elevation. The Vittorio gun, or the Veneto gun, is doing this at 35 degrees elevation. If it had a turret that could go to 45 degrees, it could go easily in excess of 50 kilometers. And so these are extremely long range, capable guns, and with very high penetration characteristics. The gunpowder cost of this is that the shells do not have the smallest bursting charge of any large gun in World War II. Which is essentially the trait that's shared with the US Super Heavy AP. Question: did naval rifles have replaceable inner sleeves to fix barrel wear, or did the entire cannon need to be replaced? That depends on what gun you're talking about. So some guns had separate liners and some guns did not. And it didn't matter if the gun was modern or not. And so you had some guns that were that were able to have the inner sleeve replaced, and some of them you had to replace the whole thing. And in all cases, it's going to be faster just to replace the whole thing. But you can basically replace the gun and then replace the sleeve on the used guns while they're outside of the ship. So what is the range of Earth's curvature at the horizon? Depends on how high you are. if you're at the top of if you're basically in the fire control tower of a World War II battleship, you're going to be able to see for about 20 kilometers or so, if not a little bit more. The Veneto and Vittorio class use the aforementioned Pugliese torpedo defense system, which was a innovative defense system that saves a lot of weight at the cost of internal volume of the ship, because essentially it took up a lot of space, but it was lightweight compared to other torpedo defense systems. What it was is essentially, imagine a large culvert, you know, the pipe that goes underneath like a road. So imagine a large culvert within the side of the ship. So a large metal tube that is hollow, doesn't have anything inside of it, that is submerged within oil and water, surrounding it, inside of it, with an armored bulkhead along the inside of the ship. And so you have this tube that's hollow within a non-compressible liquid. And so whenever a torpedo goes off next to it, ideally, the tube squishes and absorbs the energy. So it's essentially one huge crushing tube in Royal Navy parlance. The main issues with this, of course, is it takes up a lot of space, and it requires very, very high precision engineering for it to work. So the Italian ones did work. I do not have much faith that the Soviet versions would work. I don't think that their abilities to make an accurate, precise measurement like that work over such a large scale. This torpedo defense system has a lot of discussion about it, whether or not it was good, whether or not it was effective or efficient. I would say that it is notable that when these battleships were hit in the torpedo defense system, it was never defeated. It always worked. So multiple torps are always a problem for any ship that you get. And one of these ships was almost sunk by a torpedo. However, that was outside of the torpedo defense system. It was hit in the rear quadrant of the ship, which is essentially unprotected. So this defense system has a lot of detractors, but I would say it's combat proven, and which is more than can be said for a lot of other torpedo defense systems. It's designed against a 350 kilogram torpedo, which would not be effective against the Japanese torpedo, but it would be effective against anything in Europe, except maybe a Nelson torpedo. Basically, the British torpedoes at the time were about 330 kilograms to 350 kilograms. And the other thing with the littorio protection system, as mentioned in the chat, is the belt armor is a unique design. If you remember back in the armor stream that I did, or the Ships of the Line armor protection stream that I did, they have a very specific, what's called a decapping armor belt, which is essentially they have a 70 millimeter outer belt. It's angled at 8 degrees with a 250 millimeter gap in between that belt and the main belt, which is only 9.8 inches thick or something like that. Or maybe it's 11 inches thick. But essentially what it is the idea is that the armor-piercing shell hits the outer layer, loses its armor-piercing cap, so it loses some normalization ability, and then hits the inner belt and shatters on it. The inner layer between the two belts was filled in with a cellulized concrete, which is essentially concrete with bubbles in it, which was supposed to help with the protection of the ship. And then the inner armor belt is backed by layers of teak and a further 60 millimeter bulkhead on the inside of the ship. The armor protection of this was designed against 15-inch guns, So on paper, it would work against 15-inch guns. However, it is questionable because the testing that they did against this armor was with a 13.5 millimeter, it was essentially the testing they did with this gun was they took one of the modernized dreadnought guns, the 320 millimeter guns, and then increased the power of the shell to match a 15-inch gun, which in terms of armor dynamic does not give you an accurate picture of how things are going to interact, especially with the decapping layer, because the decapping layer has to be large enough for the cap to come off of, as well as generally speaking, shells behave differently against thicker armor than the size of the shell. So essentially, if your armor plate if your shell is smaller than the armor plate you are hitting, you are getting an innate disadvantage against penetration in the way shell dynamics works. So if you have a 15-inch shell hitting a 14-inch belt, you're fine. But if you have a 15-inch shell hitting a 16-inch belt, then you have basically like think of it as a debuff against shell penetration in real life. And so generally speaking, just having one thick plate is going to be better in most cases and more reliable. But this was their innovative solution to a problem of basically requiring weight savings and protection. Wood behind armor was still common in World War II. And the main thing is to provide something to drill into and to mount things onto, as well as to provide a degree of shrapnel protection and insulation for the ship. There's a bunch of different purposes that it is. It's not serving as an armor. It's serving as a layer.
By the way, on the battle we just witnessed, I was expecting it's going to go for 3 more minutes and we're just going to circle around the map. But our constellation torped the Z-44.
Giga Chad.
Sure, like...
of wood decking? No, not wood decking. Internal wood or on the inside of an armor layer. So...
So should I switch from Roma to maybe Veneto?
You can do
for
Veneto.
This one?
Yeah.
I'm going to do Veneto. And just FYI, my Veneto is secondary build, Paolo di Revel, pretty standard, I think. And we obviously need the Giuseppe Verdi flag, otherwise it doesn't make sense. We're going to try battle with.
For context here, Orochi is a huge fan of classical music. And Verdi is, of course, a classical musician and one of his favorites. So.
It's definitely like we're gonna answer the question a bit later about our favorite ship, but I think we can kind of guess which one is mine.
Yep.
So yeah.
And so the Veneto and Veneto/Littorio class had on paper extremely thick deck armor. In practice, it seems to have been insufficient. So on paper, it has anywhere from 4.5 to 6.5 inches of main deck armor, depending on where you are in the ship. Over the engines, it's a little bit weaker deck armor, but over the magazines, it's stronger deck armor. Because it's important it's more important to protect the things that go boom than the things that make you go fast.
Yeah, that's generally a good. Yeah.
But you do want the thing to protect the things that make you go fast. And so, and also a notable thing about the protection is that they did not have a conning tower in the traditional sense. Rather, basically the whole bridge section was armored with a thin layer of armor. But they did have communications armor, which is more than Bismarck can say.
Communications armor?
So you have to have wires that go from your fire control tower all the way inside of the ship. Mm-hmm. And so that entire tube from the fire control wedding cake, as they call it, down into the Citadel is protected by 200 millimeters of armor. And so there's essentially a pipe that's an armored pipe that goes all the way up through the tower.
I mean, that's definitely something important to protect. But
yeah.
Really unlike if someone hit that.
Basically everybody protected it except the Germans, and the Germans paid for it.
Because of course something hits that.
Of course something hit it, yes.
Yeah, okay.
In each Italian ships, whose rival ships were they? So Dante Alighieri rival is going to be the Tegethoff, the Virbis Unidis class. Kind of the same thing with the Cavours and the Duilios, except the Duilios and Cavours are also rivals with the Corbeil class battleships. The Caracciolo, kind of their closest competitor is going to be the basically the Queen Elizabeth Repulse and Renown, and the Revenge class. And the Vittorio Veneto class, their closest rival is going to be Bismarck and Richelieu, essentially. And so the big chunk.
Yeah, speaking of rivals.
Stonks. So these ships served pretty well throughout World War II, and the Allied powers considered them very powerful and formidable battleships. They considered them very serious threats. And the only one that was lost was Roma. Vittorio Veneto almost goes down before the Battle of during the Cape Matapan adventures. She takes a torpedo basically to a prop shaft, and that does serious damage to her, but she survives thanks to valiant damage control efforts. Roma, unfortunately, after the surrender is hit by two Fritz X bombs by German bombers, trying to deny the ships to the Allies. And the ships was sailing to Sicily, if I remember right, from Italy after the surrender, and the Germans decided to bomb them. And Roma was hit with two Fritz X bombs. The first one basically knocked out all of the at least half of the propulsion of the ship, and started a massive fire in the rear of the ship. And then the second bomb pierced the main battery magazines and detonated the ship. The detonation was so violent it threw the second turret into the sky. Poof. And the ship immediately capsized and broke in half and then sank. There were roughly 500 survivors, maybe 600, but massive loss of life, and almost immediately. Yes, a battleship turret, a 1,500-ton battleship turret. So imagine yeeting, throwing an entire destroyer into the sky.
Yeah.
Like one of those physics bugs. I think they were sailing to Sicily before they went to Malta, but it could have been straight to Malta. But they were basically sailing into Allied hands, was the idea, internment. The Littorio was renamed from Littorio to Italia, because Littorio is a symbol, is a fascist ideology symbol, so they wanted to rename that to something more Republican, and so they renamed it to Italia. And there was some plans, or there was a proposal to use Italia as a bombardment ship during the Normandy campaign. So she could have been there, but that never went through. They probably felt that they had sufficient battleship firepower, or maybe there was some other political or economic considerations in doing that. And so they didn't use her for Normandy. Basically, Littorio and Veneto end up surviving the war. They are split between between the U.S. and the U.K., and then they sell and scrap them. In terms of the accuracy of Italian guns, the myths and legends or facts thereof, there are many different arguments about what happened. And there is no objective conclusion. There is no single objective answer as to why Italian main battery guns were reported to be inaccurate throughout the war.
They probably had secondary builds.
Probably, yeah. Probably just had all secondary builds and just all the shots going everywhere.
Yeah.
But so there's no definitive conclusion to make, no single answer. So possibly it's inconsistent propellant was one of the proposed problems. So essentially the powder charge behind the shell would be inconsistent, which would deliver different muzzle velocities, which would result in shells going short and long.
And mess up the planning of the shot, basically.
Yeah. And so that's one of the possibilities. The other possibility is possibly there were two major manufacturers of these guns, which for the Vittorio class, there were two major manufacturers. There was OTO and Ansaldo. OTO is probably most famous these days for the Otto Melara 76mm automatic gun system, which is a very successful gun system these days. But there was some reason to suspect that the Ansaldo guns were inferior because they had inferior steel quality. There is a paper trail there where it could possibly be the Ansaldo guns. Possibly that it's possible that the shell tolerances. So tolerances is like how strict you are about the manufacture of things. So it's possibly that the shell's tolerances were not up to the standards of basically up to the standards of everybody else. However, that doesn't hold up really well on paper because essentially the Italian tolerances, the official Italian tolerances for naval shells are about the same as everybody else. So that seems to be probably more myth than fact. Essentially, there's another argument that maybe the shells were overstabilized, which essentially means that the guns were so high velocity and there was so much spin on the shell that it would cause it to wobble, which is a thing. You can have too much spin on a shell and too little spin. The more spin you have on a shell, the more likely it is to tumble, which is not good.
I've actually watched a couple of videos on this. Don't get into why.
Yeah.
Like, this is too much physics for anything.
And so that's another possibility. And it can also be any combination of those possibilities, and there's no one clear answer. What I suspect most is the Ansaldo guns. Regardless of all of that, the Royal Navy still held these guns in very high regard and respected them because otherwise you wouldn't see them leave as soon as they see these battleships. And so essentially, these battleships would open fire at very, very long ranges. And then the Royal Navy was just like, no, we're not dealing with that today, leave.
Yeah, I don't think so.
Yeah,
I don't
exactly.
think I will.
No, I don't think I will. And so, which suggests that the Royal Navy doesn't really care how accurate guns are because you're shooting at us with big guns.
It's like, we know they're inaccurate.
Yeah.
Although inaccuracy doesn't mean they're never going to hit, though.
This doesn't mean that the Royal Navy were leaving from fights that they had to fight. Because there were literally fights where destroyers, Royal Navy, nice.
I'm secondary. Like, I haven't scored a single secondary hit so far.
Stonks. There's even a story where a couple of destroyers were fighting. I think it was Vittorio Veneto, and the destroyers fired all of their ammunition and resorted to firing bean cans at them because their cans of beans were 120 millimeter and would fit in the guns.
What type of beans, though?
Probably baked beans. It's the British.
Do more damage?
Your breakfast beans.
I mean, if you get hit by some beans, it's emotional damage at that point, right?
Emotional damage. Literally, they were firing bean cans. And so, remember, a gun is only inaccurate until it hits you.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, there's also a strange thing where the Italian guns had worse performance the closer range you were to them. At least in terms of like what the Italian charts on accuracy show, is that they had better performance basically beyond 25,000 yards than they did at 15,000 yards, which is...
They seem pretty accurate to me.
Yeah,
Game.
which is indicative of possibly a too high velocity problem. Because if you have extremely high velocity, then you are more likely to have excessive vertical dispersion at closer ranges. And so another factor here with the regards to the quote unquote Italian shell quality tolerances is that a lot of that, the argumentation about Italian shell qualities was started by Italian admiralties and admirals trying to escape blame as well, for failures or for inaccuracy, or corruption, potentially any of those things. And so there's also a lot of like pointing of fingers going on. Basically, it's like Ansaldo was making bad shells, so that's why I failed. And so there's a lot of that you have to kind of work through and read through, and so there, which makes the problem even worse to figure out why it was this way. So overall, though, the Italian dispersion issue seems to be not as bad as the French dispersion was during World War II. The French dispersion was fixed after World War II, but during the war it was still quite not good. So the Italians had poor dispersion overall, but sometimes very accurate, and also generally, especially more effective than not. Is the bean cans thing true? As far as I'm aware, yes. And I got the bean can story from Dr. Alexander Clark, who his specialty is Royal Navy destroyers. So if anybody would know, it would be him.
So, does it actually make sense to fire them?
What else are you going to fire?
They wouldn't hold up, right?
Like, I don't know. If you have a barrel surrounding a can, the compressive force of the barrel is going to keep it from exploding, because it can't go wider than the barrel is. So if it fits in the barrel, it should go downrange. You might fire more bean than can.
But the beans are going.
Well, you're shooting
fast.
something.
So, yeah, I guess.
Oh, man. Poof. Beans.
Get beamed.
And so, but overall, these ships were quite effective. And in terms of SAP rounds, those were SAP rounds were a thing for the battleship guns. Another thing is the anti-aircraft firepower of all the Italian battleships was lacking. The 90 millimeter gun turrets, the little single guns on the side, essentially they were in the inefficient arrangement to where they couldn't really help each other in terms of firing sometimes, and they also were very unreliable turret mounts, which didn't perform well or as well as hoped. So their anti-aircraft firepower was essentially not as good as it probably could have been. There's also a split secondary battery between heavy guns and light guns, which, as time went on, proved to be not the answer. The development of like what would be the next Italian ship, in reality, would very likely be the UP-41 battleship project, which was developed by Umberto Pugliese. That's UP. For the USSR. This is the ship that they kind of formed the basis for the Sovietsky Soyuz class. They changed a lot about it as well, but this is kind of where they got a lot of the basis for it, which is essentially an enlarged Littorio class with a new hydrodynamic hull, a new torpedo defense system that does not use the Pugliese torpedo defense system, uses essentially a version of the American system, and has 16-inch guns. In all other aspects, it's very similar to Littorio. There was some proposal to work on these ships, but instead more Littorio-class ships were ordered, which was Roma and
the
Pearl.
upgraded class is like the one we see as Marco Polo and
Marco Polo
Verdi.
and Verdi, yes.
Which
Lepanto and Colombo are essentially hypotheticals made up by wargaming, by us.
like basically, even if you look at, in the game, if you have both of those ships, either Marco Polo or Verdi, like you can see that Giuseppe Verdi looks like a bigger version of Veneto. Like it's Veneto plus like 20%.
Yep. Another thing to note on the modernized and modernized dreadnoughts and the Littorio class battleships, we were mentioning how they were behind on fire control. The Italian fire control in World War II is absolutely acceptable and good. And the rangefinders are some of, if not the best in the world. Essentially, the best rangefinders in World War II are the Japanese and the Italians. The Roma, for example, had 26 different rangefinders on her for different purposes. Some of them for duplicate purposes. And basically, one of the things that the Royal Navy noted was maybe the dispersion was bad on the Italian guns, but they always had your range. They were almost always like in the first salvo or two or correctly ranging their targets, which shows you that their fire control was excellent. Their radar, well, didn't exist until basically 1942, 43, which is essentially Italy was one of the early developers of radar, actually, but
was it their idea, or did they catch the idea and say, okay, this
kind
is
of
promising?
Everybody kind of had the idea of like, if you can bounce a sound wave, you can bounce a radar wave or a radio wave, but nobody actually really so kind of everybody kind of parallel developed it, all the different countries. But Italy was kind of one of the first people in the ball game, and then they canceled it. So like 37, 38, 39, they're developing radar, and then they're like, this won't be useful. And so they drop it. And then after Cape Matapan, they're like, we need radar.
So remember that idea?
Remember that budget we canceled? Yeah, stonks. And so they developed the GUFO radar, which is what you see on top of Giuseppe Verdi here.
So while we are at Giuseppe Verdi and the radar aids, maybe I should try a game in Giuseppe Verdi.
Yep.
I'm not sure if I'm gonna try main guns or secondaries, but I have played it more as secondaries, so I'm just gonna try that. Obviously, the ship has radar, does not have a smoke screen, and I'm using enhanced secondary targeting. Again, pretty standard secondary D-level build. Flag is pirate potato, but for this time we're gonna use Giuseppe Verdi, Type 9 camo, and let's do it.
And so the Verdi design, the UP-41 design, goes on basically to have life in the Sovietsky Soyuz class, which is very heavily influenced by it, because USSR and Italy was basically had a kind of a technological exchange agreement going on as money change agreement basically, and at some point in there, the Soviets got a hold of the Pugliese torpedo defense system and basically plugged it into the ship. And so their version of the ship actually has it, but the official design does not.
So a bit on the Giuseppe Verdi, guys, because it's a bit... I'm playing it secondaries, but it has a bit of a different secondary concept. You're in between completely rushing the destroyers and completely getting focus fired by the enemy team. So you need to wait a little bit to kind of get an idea of how much hit you'll be getting during your rush. But ultimately, you want to go in, destroy any destroyer having funny plans about capping one of the objectives, go out, start re-engaging. We were talking about the topic of our favorite ships. Giuseppe Verdi is my favorite ship. Oh my god, it's so quiet without air conditioning. It's my favorite ship because of the name, because Giuseppe Verdi is one of the greatest composers of all time and my personal favorite. So this answers two questions. What's my favorite music piece from classical music piece, which is Giuseppe Verdi's Requiem, And what's my favorite ship, which is Giuseppe Verdi, from the Italian line at least.
Yeah.
I'm getting shot at.
Mine is going to be Francesco Caracciolo. I think it looks really great, and actually showed a lot of potential in terms of Italian ship design. And so if they had been able to build it on time, would have been kind of a game-changing ship, but they were unable to, owing to circumstances. So, but yeah, that's all of what I had to had prepared to cover. So if anybody has any questions, I can do some Q&A time. Oh, another like weird fun fact, with the Littorio class battleships had extraordinarily lavish and fancy officers' mess. You can find pictures of it online. I wasn't able to find any open source pictures to use for this stream, but the Italian like officers' cabins were actually hugely lavish and fancy. How well did Roma take the missile? Not well. That's what happens whenever you have a 1,500 kilogram bomb inside your ship. What Italian battleship actually built was the most successful for its time? So I would say the Vittorio Veneto is probably the most successful for its time. The thing is the Vittorio Veneto / Littorio class establishes the classic battleship configuration of 3 triple turrets with 2 forward and 1 aft. They are the first ships designed and built with this in mind. Because North Carolina comes and Yamato are the other ones that come next.
Oh, those are bomber. What? Ah, it's the guns. Never mind.
Yamato wants you real bad.
Barely wants me.
Not stonks. What was the plan for Impero again? So Impero would have been a duplicate of Roma. There was a proposal to rework her into being into a carrier, but that didn't go anywhere. So Impero would have been another Littorio class battleship, the slightly improved version that it like Roma. Roma has slightly improved basically hull hydrodynamics and slightly improved like bow and superstructure a little bit, but otherwise is very similar to Littorio and Vittorio Veneto. Do plans for the Caracciolo CV conversion exist? Would it have made a decent carrier? So the plans do, or some of the proposals do exist. Would it have made a decent carrier?
I mean, do we know what exactly the specifications of the carrier would be?
No, I don't think we do. But essentially, the hull design for Caracciolo provides a reasonable amount of space and a good amount of speed. But it would have been very inefficient as a carrier, because one of the weird things with the Caracciolo class was the engine rooms were completely overbuilt. Every single boiler and every single turbine in the Caracciolo class had their own room. So essentially every single turbine and boiler room had their own subdivided compartment. Most of the time, ships will combine 2 to 4 boilers in each room, for context. And so with a ship that has 20 boilers in it or more, having 20 different rooms for all your boilers and turbines is excessive. It would help with flooding, yes, but there's a such thing as too much of a good thing is sometimes a bad thing. It's a lot of weight and excessive things. Design. Did the Italians even work on a plan to copy the Iowas, or at least the guns? No. So the Italians did not need a ship like Iowa, because they had the Littorios, which had guns almost equivalent in firepower to Iowa, at least in penetration, not in damage. But they believed that they were very effective, and they were easily capable of 30 to 31 knots. So why would they need an Iowa? Hello.
So in the meantime, since we're done with the historical Italian battleships and how we got from basically Dante Alighieri that we have in the game towards Vittorio Veneto, and talking about how this could have transitioned to Giuseppe Verdi and Marco Polo. Recently, we had the newest addition to our bureau, which is Battleship Cristoforo Colombo. To my understanding, this was this wasn't a historical ship, but there were designs or hints towards it being something in the future. So this is the latest bureau project. It came alongside Smalland and Henry.
Yep.
It is okay. Like, there are two ways to play Cristoforo Colombo. You can either go for secondaries or main guns. I tried both. I think main guns is way better. So while we are answering questions, and do drop more questions about the Italian battleship line or anything else you want to know about them, any points you need more clear, drop them now while I play a few battles with Cristoforo Colombo.
Okay. So what was down the line, the max Veneto could travel with such a small oil cap? So Narico, you have to realize the Italians don't care about range. All they care about is needs to operate in the Mediterranean, which is not a large ocean. And so the Italians don't really care about their battleship range. They don't need a battleship that can go 15,000 miles. They need a battleship that can go 5,000, 6,000. That's all they need. So there's no need to develop a ship like that. What Italian battleship would you like to see added next to the game? I would like to see the full bird Caracciolo class with all 12 guns. I would love to see that at some point. How realistic is Napoli? Napoli is based off of an Ansaldo design for basically a super cruiser for the Soviet Navy. And essentially, the idea with Napoli is that they develop and start building the ship, and then World War II breaks out, and so they just take it over before they ship it to the USSR. So, like, it's doable. Is it practical? Probably not. What's better on a battleship in the game? More penetration or more damage? In the game, go for more damage.
So that's a question. Are there any remaining Italian museum ships?
Yes, there are. There are a couple mass boats that are remaining, which are like their torpedo boats, which were highly effective during World War II. And there is also a part of, or maybe even a full protected cruiser that Italy has as a museum ship.
But no, none of these battleships survived today, basically.
5 to 6K miles only. Yikes, Yamato wants to have a word. So Yamato has to deal with the Pacific Ocean. Vittorio Veneto does not have to deal with the Pacific Ocean. In any case, like, there's no interest in, Italy has no interest in fighting a war in the Pacific. They only have to fight a war in the Mediterranean. So they don't need to go very far from home. They don't even really need to go into the Atlantic. So Aquila. So Aquila was a carrier conversion that they wanted to make of basically they wanted to take a cruise liner and make it into a aircraft carrier. They got most of the way done with doing that, but they never finished it. Would a Napoli be a good counter to the Dunkirks? Not a good counter. They could fight a Dunkirk, but they would not stand a good chance of winning a fight against a Dunkirk. Did any battleships survive World War II besides Veneto? Yes, both Veneto and Littorio, renamed to Italia at that time, survived, and some of the modernized dreadnoughts survived. Giulio Cesare stayed in service until 1956 in the Soviet Navy because she was given to them as a war prize as the ship Novosibirsk. U.S., Japan, and Britain were really the only ones that needed a long-range high-endurance battleship, and really only the U.S. and Japan. Britain had bases all over the world, so they could refuel almost anywhere that they needed to go to. So British battleships don't actually have that long a range. Were the Austro-Hungarian battleships comparable with the Italian ones? So in World War I, the Austro-Hungarian battleships were pretty comparable, yeah. Both of them didn't really have fire control. They both had 12 or 13 12-inch guns. The Austro-Hungarian ships are better armored, but also the build quality, the construction quality on some of the Austro-Hungarian ships was not very good. So I'd say all in all, the ships are quite comparable. Did the Veneto even have a chance against the Musashi? So Veneto's guns absolutely could do damage to a Japanese battleship, but the armor on a Veneto would not hold up against the Musashi. So so a chance, yes. A good chance, not as good as in Iowa, but better than Bismarck, I would say. Out of all the Italian ships, which was the dangerous ships? So the most dangerous ship out of all the Italian ships would have been Roma, because she was the most modern. She got a radar towards the end of her life. Not an advanced radar by any means, but she had one. And so she would have been the most advanced and dangerous. Are you guys planning on adding Monarch Hull B or Temeraire buff? No plans right now. But this is not really this is more of a history stream than a gameplay stream, so.
But if you have any feedback, join the Discord. We have a dedicated channel, links down below. Share your feedback there. There is more chance we will actually remember it.
Yep. Yeah, a lot of cruise liners served as troop transports in World War I and World War II.
Not the best game.
Yeah, you got 80k.
Could have done more.
Oh, wait, no, you got more than 80k. No, it's 80k. How did Italy name their battleships? Cesare was a big influence, but it was only a smaller ship than big Vittorio class. So Italy named their battleships World War I Italy named their battleships after famous Italians. So you have Dante Alighieri, the poet, Caio Duilio, famous Roman commander of the Carthaginian Wars, Giulio Cesare, which is Julius Caesar, Andrea Doria, another famous admiral, Leonardo da Vinci needs no introduction. So it's all the famous people. And then in World War II, you have Littorio, which is basically named after the lictors, which is like a type of like a disciplinary position in Rome. It's a kind of a fascist symbol. And then you have Vittorio Veneto, which is named after a victory, the victory of Vittorio Veneto, which is basically the World War I battle that ended World War I for Italy. Then you have Impero, which is...
Veneto is from Venezia?
Yeah. It's that region of northeastern Italy. And then you have Roma, which is Rome, and Impero, which is empire. They had a big, let's say, fetish for the Roman Empire at that point in time.
Everyone kind of has.
Yeah, at some point in time.
Especially now, there is a meme going on with the Roman Empire. I don't know why. Like everyone's thinking about the Roman Empire.
So, first BBs, weren't they just armored gunboats that got bigger and bigger? So battleships did constantly get bigger and bigger over time, but essentially, battleship comes from all the way back to like ships like HMS Victory, all the way to what they had in World War II. So, do any of the Italian battleships have any oops moments like beaching? Leonardo da Vinci hit a sea mine.
It's not
So,
a noopsie. It's a yeah.
If Italy had radar during the Battle of Taranto, would the battle have gone into Italy's favor? No, because the Battle of Taranto was essentially a attack on Pearl Harbor type scenario. So essentially, they would have probably known that the swordfish were coming sooner, but they wouldn't be able to do anything about it. Is there any big battle that an Italian battleship was involved? There are lots of random battles. So you have the Battle of Calabria or Punta Stilo, depending on what side of the war you're looking at. And also the Battle of Cape Matapan, and a bunch of smaller cruiser actions that they got involved in. I think the things like radar and nuclear power weren't invented, battleships would have continued getting bigger and bigger. Probably not.
No, I don't think nuclear power was what made battleships obsolete.
No, because aircraft carriers and submarines are the things that ruined, that ended the era of battleships.
They ruined it.
Soiled it. Favorite Italian ship, if any, and why? Luca Tarigo. Luca Tarigo basically 3v got into a fight 3v1 against the Royal Navy destroyers, and then came out of it sunk, but sank one of the Royal Navy destroyers, which then resulted in a chain of events where basically Italian frogmen dived on the wreck of the British destroyer, got information on the port in Alexandria, which allowed them to disable both Queen Elizabeth and Valiant in dock. So Luca Tarigo is it. Biggest victory for an Italian battleship? That's the neat part. There really isn't much of a big victory. There are smaller victories where they just force the Royal Navy to stop doing things, but there isn't really a big victory for them. How good was the anti-aircraft on Veneto? Not very good.
By the way, Blip, what's your favorite Italian battleship?
Francesco Caracciolo.
Caracciolo.
Yeah.
And reasoning? Why?
I like the potential it had. If it had been built on time, then it would have been kind of the next hot big thing. But it's just very good looking the way we have it in Legends and in real life. So and I like how it plays in game. So,
by the way, while we're here, and we have the very loyal viewers with us, let's throw in a poll, because we do plan on doing more of these streams. So we want your opinion on what's the next theme for Ship of the Line will be. So This is your chance now. We have 3 options. Choose which one you'd like to see, and let us know.
Yep. Would the Zara class have been able to go up against the Mogami class? Yes. There are no special codes for today unless there's one on social media, but we're not giving away anything on the stream. But go ahead and vote for what we will do next for history. And so we have the option of Japanese cruisers, German cruisers, and weird and wacky ships. So we're going to look at basically like what we would do there is look at like some of the weird ships that I know about, and I'll see about trying to get access to some documents and things like that I could show. But of course, also German cruisers and Japanese cruisers, because I do have access to really good books on German cruisers, and the book there is like one book on the Japanese cruisers, and I have access to that book.
You've read it, right?
I haven't read it.
You can't read it really.
Like it's like a 900-page book.
Casual afternoon.
It is a tome. I haven't had the need to read it yet. So,
I mean, does it work like a book or is it more like a dictionary?
it's like an encyclopedia to all things Japanese cruiser, essentially.
Orochi, what is your favorite Italian ship? Give your reason and why. As I said, I'm a huge fan of classical music. Giuseppe Verdi, very famous composer and important composer. So I tend to view Giuseppe Verdi as my favorite Italian ship.
Yep, I'm trying to find it. There's supposed to be a Fritz X on Roma somewhere, but I can't remember where it is.
If you find it, take the camera as well.
Yeah. There's Roma. It might have been there at one point, but they might have removed it. Unless it's hiding in there somewhere. No, there's supposed to be a Fritz X on Roma somewhere, but it may have been removed. I'm not sure.
Maybe on the other side.
Yeah, there was supposed to be a Fritz X on Roma and a Caesar salad full of knives on Giulio Cesare.
Who added that?
The 3D monitors want to make an Easter egg, so
Sure. We do add occasionally some very small Easter eggs on ships.
Yeah, there's one in Graf Spee as well. Yeah, I'm not sure where the Fritz X is on Roma, but
do we have any other last questions, guys?
Yep. How much are the rentals going to change based on the spreadsheets, Blip? Depends on the spreadsheets.
Yeah, exactly.
Depends on what the magic conch says. Favorite meme ship is the Atlanta class. No. I'm talking about like meme ships. Maybe some of them would have been built, but most of them are probably not going to have been built because they're meme ships. Think weird and wacky ships like trying to think what's the weirdest ship we have in the game, but I don't know offhand.
Weirdest?
Yeah.
Tiger?
Yeah, I guess Tiger probably weirdest, yeah. I don't know. So
Oh, Graf Space, not a meme ship.
yeah, USS Possible would absolutely be covered. That's one of my favorite meme ships. Yeah, Okhotnik.
Oh,
Yeah, that's a good.
yeah.
Okhotnik. I actually have the documents on Okhotnik.
Okhotnik is basically someone just trying to build a ship and being like copy paste until they run out of space.
Yeah.
Don't know how much that worked in battle, though. Was Okhotnik a real ship?
It was a real design, but it never got built.
Oh, okay.
So when do we get the Great Eastern tech line?
Oh, yeah.
Great Eastern was basically the largest ship in the world for like 40 years until Titanic.
Iolo Emilio? I mean, Paolo Emilio
In
was...
terms of gameplay, I guess, but
It's very unique. It's very effective. I've played the Paolo Emilio on stream a couple of times and it went really well. Habakkuk? I mean, the fact that Habakkuk was actually considered and there was some sense into it.
yeah. I mean,
Man.
like it was a logical solution to the problem that they were having, but it was not the best solution.
It is a solution, which probably helped direct.
Which, I mean, alcohol is a solution, and it would probably result in a design like Habakkuk. But,
That would make sense, yeah.
but it's like,
Sounds good, doesn't work, basically, yeah.
but it's like, a chemical solution to a logical problem.
Yeah, RAM ships were kind of like
Yeah,
2,000 years late.
Well, no. Well, there was a time because of Italy or in a
Not
battle with
2,000, but more
Italy.
like 1.5,000.
There was a time in the 1860s, basically, where like rams became a thing again, because basically the Battle of Lissa was between Italy and Austria-Hungary, and Austria-Hungary completely schooled Italy with basically a bunch of wooden ships and a couple ironclads, and Italy was like all ironclads. And then Austria-Hungary comes in and schools Italy with a like 1810s ship of the line, like 100-gun HMS Victory coming in, just ramming ironclads. And so basically, like it rammed like 4 ships in this battle. And so for a time there, it was basically like people were like, you can't shoot ironclads because the shells will bounce off, but you can ram them. And so there was a period of time where like from basically like 1860 to like 1900 where like all ships were built with a ram bow.
So you're saying that they skilled issue them, basically.
Yeah.
Like, can't hit the ship? Like, might as well. Can you show the best build for Udachi? Maybe on another stream.
Yeah.
Or come to our Discord and probably someone will have a pretty good build for Udachi.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay.
But I think that's that. Like we got through everything I had planned for tonight, pretty much on time. Got some questions and Q&A in. Got some gameplay in. So thank you guys for coming back for the return of Ships of the Line. Hope you enjoyed it and look forward to it. I'll have to see what the topic is. Show results. Oh no. Oh no. Did the Oh Jesus! Did the straw poll break?
I'm not sure.
I think it broke.
We'll see what happened with that. But anyway, guys, we figured it out. Don't worry.
Yep.
Thank you very much for joining us today for this Ships of the Line stream. We do plan to do more of this type of streams and also more themed streams, I guess, in the near future.
Yep.
So stick around for that. Follow our socials. That's where we announce what we're going to be doing in these streams. Join our Discord for any questions or to type with the rest of the chat outside of this chat. And thank you very much. Have a good night and have a great week, everyone. See ya.
Have a good one. Thanks to you for coming, everyone. Bye.